Consider the moment when you find yourself in the depths of genuine suffering, whether it arrives as a sudden loss, a prolonged illness, a professional catastrophe, or the slow erosion of a relationship you once believed would last forever. And in that moment of acute pain, the mind cannot conceive of a future state different from the present one, as if the current suffering has become the permanent furniture of your existence. An unchangeable fact of reality rather than a temporary condition moving through time like everything else. You lie awake at night convinced that this particular ache in your chest will never lift, that this anxiety will become your constant companion, that this humiliation will define you forever, that this loss has stolen something from you that cannot possibly be recovered or replaced, and the certainty with which you hold these beliefs feels as immutable as the laws of physics themselves. Yet if you look back across your own life with honest attention, you will find countless examples of moments that once felt absolutely permanent but which have since shifted, evolved, or disappeared entirely. Problems that consumed your entire consciousness for weeks or months or years, but which now barely register when you think about them, if you think about them at all. A phenomenon so consistent across human experience that it has been encoded into wisdom traditions and philosophical teachings for millennia. The mechanism behind this truth operates on a fundamental principle of impermanence that governs all aspects of existence. The recognition that nothing maintains its exact form or intensity forever, that change is not something that might happen but the very nature of being alive itself, and our nervous systems are actually designed to process and move through difficult experiences, to metabolize suffering and transform it into something that no longer dominates our internal landscape. Yet we have developed a peculiar habit of treating our current emotional state as though it were a permanent feature rather than a weather pattern passing through. We narrate our suffering as though it is the truth of who we are, building identities around our pain and then defending those identities fiercely, telling ourselves stories about how this particular situation is different, how our case is unique, how the normal rules of change and healing do not apply to us, and we repeat these narratives so consistently that we begin to believe them as firmly as we believe in gravity, creating a psychological stuckness that can persist long after the actual circumstances would naturally have shifted on their own. The paradox here is that the very impermanence that frightens us during moments of acute pain is simultaneously the mechanism by which suffering eventually releases its grip. The same force that brings loss also ensures that grief cannot remain at peak intensity forever. The same passage of time that makes today's catastrophe feel unbearable tomorrow becomes the foundation for healing and perspective. Yet we spend our energy resisting this truth rather than surrendering to it, insisting that our current moment must be different from all the others, that this is somehow the permanent state against which all previous experiences of change and recovery do not apply. When you finally stop fighting against the current of change and instead accept that this moment, like every moment before it, will transform into something else entirely, you discover that the suffering loses some of its grip not because the circumstances have changed, but because you have stopped demanding that they remain frozen in time, and in that acceptance lies a peculiar freedom. The recognition that you do not have to engineer the future, only to stop insisting that the present must be permanent. When you truly internalize this understanding, you begin to notice that the relief does not arrive as a dramatic moment of transformation, but rather as 1,000 small instances of noticing that you survived yesterday's unbearable weight, and then the day before that, accumulating evidence that your nervous system has been quietly There exists a particular moment in the lives of most people where they find themselves lying awake at night, mentally cataloging their perceived failures and shortcomings, constructing an elaborate inventory of all the ways in which they believe themselves to be inadequate or insufficient for the lives they inhabit. They review conversations where they said the wrong thing, moments where they performed less than perfectly, accomplishments that fell short of some imagined standard, and bodies that do not match some internalized template of acceptability. This mental auditing is so commonplace, so woven into the fabric of ordinary consciousness that most people scarcely notice they are doing it at all. They move through their days with the unspoken conviction that they require improvement, that their current state represents some kind of unfinished draft that must be revised and refined before they can truly deserve rest, acceptance, or peace. The mechanism driving this persistent sense of insufficiency is deeply rooted in how human beings have constructed their social hierarchies and measures of worth. From earliest childhood, people are evaluated constantly through grades and test scores, through comparison with siblings and peers, through the approval or disapproval reflected in the eyes of authority figures. The message becomes encoded in the nervous system that value must be earned, that acceptance is conditional, that one's fundamental okayness depends on meeting external standards that shift and change depending on context. The psychological apparatus that emerges from this conditioning is remarkably efficient at generating dissatisfaction because it ties a person's sense of self to an endless series of moving targets. There is always another skill to develop, another achievement to pursue, another way to optimize the self. What is remarkable is that this operates as a kind of mass delusion that persists despite having no logical foundation. Consider that you are, at this very moment, a product of billions of years of evolutionary refinement, an enormously complex organism that maintains its own body temperature, heals its own wounds, creates its own consciousness, and navigates an incomprehensibly complicated world. Every single thing your body does automatically, every breath and heartbeat and thought and feeling, represents an achievement of staggering sophistication. You are sufficient to maintain your own life right now. You are sufficient to love and be loved. You are sufficient to experience beauty and meaning. Yet despite this fundamental sufficiency, the cultural narrative has been so thoroughly internalized that people often spend decades chasing the feeling that they will finally, eventually, become enough if only they achieve the next goal or fix the next flaw. The tragedy of this is not that ambition or growth are meaningless, but that the pursuit has been severed from presence, disconnected from the possibility of simply accepting what already is. You are enough not because you are perfect or flawless or because you have accomplished great things, but because sufficiency is not something that needs to be earned or proven or demonstrated to anyone. It is simply the baseline truth of existing as a conscious being in this world. When you release the exhausting project of proving your worth, what becomes possible is not complacency, but genuine engagement with life. The freedom to pursue growth because it interests you rather than because you fear the alternative, to make choices based on what matters to you rather than what might finally make you acceptable to an imagined audience that exists only in your mind. This is the paradox that transforms everything. The moment you stop trying to become enough, you discover you always were, and in that discovery, you become free to build a life that actually reflects who you are rather than who you thought you needed to be. That freedom is not an escape from responsibility, but an invitation to live with authenticity, to show up as yourself rather than as the person you imagined you needed to become to be worthy of your own life. Consider the typical architecture of human anxiety, the way we construct elaborate scenarios in our minds about futures that will almost certainly never arrive. You lie awake at night imagining a difficult conversation with your boss, rehearsing arguments and defensive statements, feeling your heart race as though the conversation is happening in real time, only to find that when the actual moment comes, it unfolds entirely differently than you predicted, or perhaps it never happens at all. Energy you spent in those midnight hours, the cortisol flooding your system, the mental exhaustion from cycling through worst-case outcomes, was essentially burned on a fiction you created. This pattern repeats across countless dimensions of our lives, from social interactions to health concerns to financial uncertainties, yet we continue to live as though our worried predictions are accurate prophecies rather than imaginative constructions. The research on this phenomenon is remarkably consistent and clear. Studies examining worry and anxiety show that the vast majority of things people spend their time worrying about never actually occur, or when they do occur, they occur in far less severe or problematic ways than the worried mind predicted. One well-documented finding suggests that approximately 85% of what people worry about never happens, and for the 15% that does happen, 79% of people report they coped with it better than they expected they would. This means our worry apparatus is essentially operating at a fundamental accuracy rate of somewhere between nearly zero and moderately low, yet we continue to treat our anxious thoughts as urgent warnings deserving of our immediate mental resources and emotional energy. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is worth understanding, because understanding it creates a subtle shift in how you relate to your own worried thoughts. Your brain evolved in an environment where threats were often immediate and visible, where a rustle in the grass could be a predator, and where assuming the worst and preparing for it sometimes meant survival. That threat detection system is extraordinarily sensitive by design because the cost of missing a real threat was historically death, while the cost of false alarms was merely discomfort and wasted energy. In the modern world, however, this sensitivity has become misaligned with our actual environment. We face far fewer genuine immediate threats, yet our brains continue to run the same threat detection protocols, generating vivid scenarios of social embarrassment, financial ruin, serious illness, relationship dissolution, professional failure, and countless other negative outcomes. Once your mind generates these scenarios, they feel real because they activate the same neural pathways and emotional responses as actual threats, flooding your body with stress chemicals and keeping you in a state of vigilance. But here is the paradox that persists despite being logically obvious once you examine it. We know from experience and from evidence that most worries do not materialize, yet we continue to treat each new worry as though it might be the exception, as though this time our anxious predictions might actually come true. We have lived through hundreds or thousands of situations where our worries proved unfounded, where the dreaded outcome never arrived or was far less terrible than imagined. Yet somehow this accumulated evidence does not significantly reduce our tendency to worry about future events. This suggests that worry operates somewhat independently of logic and evidence, that it has become such a normalized part of how we navigate uncertainty that we struggle to question it even when we intellectually understand its fundamental inaccuracy. The persistence of worry, despite its unreliability, points to something interesting about how our minds have adapted to modern uncertainty. Rather than accepting that we cannot predict or control the future, we engage in the illusion of control through worry, as though the mental rehearsal somehow prepares us or protects us from harm. Consider the way you move through your day, the routines you've built, the relationships you've nurtured, the achievements you've celebrated, and the struggles you've endured. You wake each morning with the implicit assumption that the world around you will remain relatively stable, that the people you love will be there, that your circumstances will persist into tomorrow, and that the difficulties weighing on you today might last indefinitely. Yet the observable truth of existence, if you pause long enough to examine it, reveals something profoundly different. The body you inhabit is not permanent. It changes daily at a cellular level, continuously dying and regenerating in ways you cannot perceive or control. The emotions you feel in this very moment, whether they are joy, sadness, anxiety, or contentment, are not fixed states, but rather temporary fluctuations that naturally rise and fall like waves on an ocean. The job you worry about losing will eventually end, whether through retirement, change, or circumstance. The relationships that feel eternal are ultimately bound by the finite span of human life. Even the planet beneath your feet undergoes constant transformation, eroding, shifting, and evolving across timescales both geological and human. This impermanence operates according to a simple and elegant mechanism that requires no belief system to function. Everything that begins must eventually end. This is not metaphysical philosophy, but observable fact woven into the fabric of physical reality. When you understand that impermanence is not a punishment or a flaw in the design of existence, but rather the fundamental condition of all things, something shifts in how you perceive your circumstances. The pain you feel now cannot hurt you forever because pain itself is temporary. The joy you experience today will fade not because happiness is cruel or insufficient, but because the very nature of experience requires change and alternation. Your worries about the future are concerns about temporary conditions, yet somehow this logical truth rarely penetrates the anxiety you feel. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly this knowledge fails to comfort most people despite its logical clarity and universal application. You can intellectually understand that nothing lasts, yet you spend your hours as though everything is permanent, clinging to aspects of life that are inherently fleeting, resisting the inevitable changes that define existence itself. You grieve losses as though they were unexpected when change and loss are woven into every moment. You cling to comfort and security as though permanence were possible when impermanence is the only true constant. This disconnect between what you know and how you live persists because acceptance of impermanence requires a fundamental reorientation of how you relate to experience itself. It demands that you release your grip on the assumption of permanence and instead learn to value and appreciate things precisely because they are temporary, because their transient nature makes them precious rather than diminishing their worth. When you hold your child's hand knowing they will eventually grow beyond your reach, or when you savor a meal understanding it will soon be consumed and forgotten, you begin to practice this reorientation, finding meaning not in permanence but in presence, not in the false security of things lasting forever, but in the intimate act of fully experiencing what is here now, in this moment that is already passing. This is where the paradox resolves itself. By accepting that everything ends, you become free to actually live, to move through your days without the constant background hum of resistance against reality, to meet each encounter, whether with a person, an accomplishment, or a sunset, with the full attention it deserves precisely because you know it will not return in quite this way again. When you finally stop postponing your life in service of an imagined permanent future, you discover that the present moment, fleeting as it is, contains everything worth having. Consider the modern worker who has internalized the belief that every moment not spent working is a moment wasted, a gap in productivity that must be filled with guilt and anxiety. This person lies in bed at night unable to sleep, their mind racing through unfinished tasks and pending emails, their body tense with the knowledge that they are not accomplishing anything in this moment, and therefore they are failing. They wake in the morning exhausted, yet they push themselves harder, believing that rest is a luxury they cannot afford, that sleep is something to be minimized rather than honored as a biological necessity. They look at their peers who seem to achieve more while sleeping less and interpret this as evidence of superior discipline and work ethic, never considering that the human brain and body operate on cycles of exertion and recovery that have been proven by decades of neuroscience research to be absolutely fundamental to optimal functioning. What makes rest truly productive is the mechanism by which the brain consolidates memories, processes emotional information, and performs critical maintenance during sleep that simply cannot occur while we are awake and conscious. When we rest, our neurons form new connections, our memories are sorted and integrated into long-term storage, our immune system strengthens, and our mental clarity sharpens for the challenges ahead. Deep rest activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which directs blood flow toward digestion and cellular repair, undoing the damage caused by prolonged stress responses and allowing the body to heal itself at a fundamental level. Yet despite overwhelming scientific evidence demonstrating that rest directly enhances creativity, problem-solving ability, decision-making quality, and emotional resilience, we have somehow normalized the idea that rest is something separate from work, something that detracts from productivity rather than enables it. We have created a cultural mythology around sleeplessness and constant activity, treating exhaustion as a badge of honor and fatigue as proof of dedication, when in fact the most productive and innovative individuals throughout history have been those who understood that their best work emerged not from relentless pushing, but from alternating cycles of focused effort and genuine recovery. This contradiction persists because we have lost touch with the fundamental rhythm of human existence, replacing it with arbitrary measures of output that do not account for the invisible but critical work happening within our biology when we finally rest. The paradox is that by honoring rest as essential work rather than time stolen from work, we paradoxically become more productive, our insights sharper, our creativity unleashed, our capacity for sustained effort renewed. To reclaim rest as productive is to reclaim our humanity, to acknowledge that we are not machines designed for ceaseless output, but biological beings whose greatest achievements require the wisdom to stop. This wisdom that stopping is not surrender but strategy is what separates those who burn out from those who sustain excellence across decades, what allows a mind to return to the same problem after sleep and suddenly see the solution that eluded conscious effort, what transforms rest from guilty escape into the essential architecture upon which all meaningful work is built. The neurologist who discovered the solution to a decades-old research problem during a vacation, the artist who found their breakthrough after months of sabbatical, the entrepreneur whose most successful strategy emerged from a weekend of doing nothing. These are not anomalies, but illustrations of a principle so fundamental that ignoring it is not ambition but self-sabotage. When we finally understand that rest is not the opposite of productivity, but its prerequisite, we begin to build lives and organizations around what actually works rather than what merely looks like work. There exists a universal human experience that transcends culture, geography, and circumstance, and it is the quiet but undeniable process by which the passage of time softens the sharp edges of our suffering and transforms acute pain into something we can eventually carry without being crushed beneath its weight. When we experience loss, whether it is the death of someone we love, the end of a meaningful relationship, the failure of a dream we held dear, or any of the countless disappointments that punctuate a human life, the pain arrives with an intensity that often feels permanent and absolute, as though we will never know lightness again, and the heaviness we feel in our chest will remain our constant companion forever. Yet what we gradually discover, sometimes with surprise and sometimes with quiet resignation, is that the very passage of days and weeks and months has a subtle but transformative effect on our grief, slowly diluting its concentration, gradually allowing other moments and experiences to exist alongside it rather than be entirely eclipsed by it. The mechanism behind this healing is neither mystical nor particularly complex, rooted instead in the neurological reality that human memory and emotional intensity both naturally decay over time, that the vividness of a painful moment cannot be sustained indefinitely by our nervous systems, and that repetition and routine create new neural pathways that exist in parallel to the ones created by trauma and loss. When we wake up each morning after significant pain, we must choose, consciously or unconsciously, to engage with the world again, to eat breakfast, to respond to messages, to complete small tasks. And in doing so, we create moments of normalcy that gradually weave themselves back into the fabric of our existence, diluting the concentration of grief with the simple continuation of living. What is perhaps most remarkable about this phenomenon is that it persists as one of the most reliable truths we know about the human condition, something that we have witnessed countless times in our own lives and in the lives of those around us, yet we seem perpetually surprised when it happens to us, as though our particular suffering is somehow exempt from the rules that govern all other suffering. We live through smaller versions of this healing constantly without acknowledging it, moving through disappointments and rejections and embarrassments that felt earth-shattering in their moment, but which fade into background noise within weeks. Yet when confronted with major loss, we often convince ourselves that this time is different, that this pain will not follow the same natural trajectory toward lessening, that we are fundamentally broken in a way that time cannot mend. Perhaps what makes this truth so relaxing to consider as we rest is the permission it grants us to stop fighting against the passage of time, to understand that healing is not something we must actively force or engineer, but rather something that happens naturally through the simple act of continuing to exist, of allowing days to follow days, and of gradually discovering that the weight we carry becomes lighter not because we are strong enough to make it so, but because time itself, in its patient and indifferent way, has already begun the work of transformation. And in this understanding lies a quiet comfort, that we need not rush our healing, need not judge ourselves for still feeling the weight of old sorrows on difficult days, because the work of time continues whether we are aware of it or not, moving forward with or without our permission, carrying us gradually from where we were toward where we will become. In this way, time becomes not our enemy but our ally, asking nothing of us except that we show up for our own lives, and in the most ordinary moments, a laugh shared with a friend, the warmth of sunlight on our skin, the completion of a task we thought impossible, we find evidence that healing was never contingent on our effort, but rather on our willingness to let it happen. Consider the moment when you realize you have made an error, perhaps at work or in a conversation, and notice how your body responds with a sudden tightness in your chest, a flush of heat across your face, and an almost overwhelming urge to apologize, explain, or somehow undo what has been said or done. This reaction feels utterly natural and necessary, as though the mistake itself represents some fundamental failure in your character or competence. Yet when you pause and examine what has actually occurred, you will find that nothing catastrophic has happened. A mistake is simply an action or decision that did not produce the outcome you intended. It is information, nothing more. Your brain received input from the world, processed it according to its current understanding, and generated a response that did not align with reality or your goals. This is exactly how learning works. Every scientist understands that experiments which produce unexpected results are not failures, but rather the most valuable form of feedback. Every engineer knows that the first prototype will not function perfectly, and this is precisely why prototypes exist. Every musician recognizes that mistakes during practice are the moments when the brain identifies what needs adjustment. Yet somehow when we make mistakes in our daily lives, we have learned to treat them as personal indictments rather than as neutral pieces of information about how the world actually works. This disconnect persists because we have been conditioned since childhood to fear mistakes, to associate them with punishment or shame, to view them as reflections of our inherent worth rather than as simple misalignments between expectation and outcome. Our educational systems rewarded perfection and penalized errors. Our social environments taught us that admitting mistakes was weakness. Our culture valorizes those who appear never to stumble, so we internalize the belief that mistakes are bad things that happen to us, rather than understanding them as the fundamental mechanism through which all improvement occurs. The reality is that mistakes are data about the gap between your current model of reality and how reality actually functions. When you make a mistake, you have received the most direct, most visceral form of feedback available. Your muscles have learned something your conscious mind may not have registered yet. your intuition has gathered information. The world has shown you something about itself that you did not previously know. As you rest and allow this perspective to settle into your mind, you might notice how much lighter it feels to treat a mistake not as a failure, but as a completed data point in the endless process of understanding how things actually work. The tightness in your chest can ease when you recognize that every person, every expert, every successful person you admire has made far more mistakes than they have succeeded. The number of errors is not a measure of inadequacy, but rather a measure of how much learning has occurred, how many hypotheses have been tested, how thoroughly someone has explored the boundaries of what is possible. When you next encounter a mistake, your own or someone else's, you might pause before the shame response arrives and ask instead, "What is this teaching me? What does this reveal about how I was thinking, what I was assuming, where my understanding was incomplete?" In that single shift of perspective, the mistake transforms from an accusation into an invitation to grow, to recalibrate, to understand yourself and the world more accurately. This is the gift that every mistake offers if you can learn to receive it without the armor of defensiveness, simply as information waiting to reshape how you move forward. And over time, as you practice this reframing, you will notice that your relationship to risk itself begins to transform. You become willing to attempt things you previously avoided, to speak up in meetings, to try new approaches, because you have removed the existential threat from the possibility of getting it wrong. Consider the experience of learning a musical instrument or developing a new skill, where you might practice consistently for weeks and feel yourself improving steadily, only to hit a sudden plateau where no amount of effort seems to produce any noticeable change. And then mysteriously, almost without warning, you break through that barrier and find yourself at a new level of competence that feels almost effortless once you've crossed that threshold. This pattern repeats throughout life in ways both subtle and profound, yet we construct narratives around progress as though it should be a smooth upward trajectory, a constant accumulation of gains with each day building predictably upon the last. The reality of growth is far messier than this comfortable fiction, marked instead by periods of rapid advancement followed by long stretches of stagnation, by apparent regression that later reveals itself as necessary integration, by invisible progress happening beneath the surface long before any external manifestation becomes visible to the world or even to yourself. We see this in emotional development, where you might work through a trauma or limiting belief for months with seemingly no change, only to discover one day that your entire relationship to that wound has shifted and you can no longer quite remember what the panic felt like. We see it in professional advancement, where expertise doesn't accumulate in a steady line, but rather in sudden comprehensions after long periods of confusion, where competence appears to arrive all at once even though the groundwork was being laid throughout the invisible hours of struggle. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in how complex systems actually function, how learning involves the brain reorganizing itself at multiple levels simultaneously, how some growth happens at thresholds where accumulated small changes suddenly produce qualitative shifts in capability or understanding. Yet despite knowing this, despite having lived through it repeatedly, we remain creatures who expect linear progress, who interpret plateaus as failure, who feel disappointment when the world doesn't reward effort with immediate visible returns, and who often abandon pursuits just before the breakthrough they were approaching would have arrived. This gap between knowing intellectually that growth is nonlinear and still emotionally expecting it to be predictable and constant reflects something deeply human about our desire for control and certainty, our need for the world to make sense in ways that feel manageable and measurable, our struggle to trust processes we cannot fully see or quantify in real time. The paradox is that accepting nonlinear growth requires a kind of faith that runs counter to our modern instinct for optimization and quantification. We must learn to value the plateau as much as the peak, to trust that the fallow periods are not wasted time but necessary composting, and to recognize that the most profound transformations often announce themselves only in retrospect, long after we've stopped looking for them. Perhaps this is why the most generative question we can ask ourselves during periods of apparent stagnation is not, "Am I making progress?" but rather, "What am I becoming?" A subtle shift in focus that releases us from the tyranny of measurable outcomes and allows us to attend to the deeper reorganization happening within, trusting that the person we are becoming will eventually make sense of all the invisible work we're doing right now. And in this reframing lies the seeds of patience, not the passive waiting of resignation, but the active patience of someone who understands that the seedling becoming a tree does not apologize for its seasons of dormancy, that each apparent pause is the necessary work of deepening roots, of building the internal architecture that will eventually support growth none of us can yet imagine. When we finally understand this, when we stop fighting the rhythm of growth and instead learn to move with it, we discover that patience itself becomes the practice, and the deepening roots become visible only when we look back. Consider the person you were 10 years ago, the specific thoughts you held, the beliefs you considered absolute, the fears that seemed insurmountable, the dreams you were certain would define your entire existence. Now consider who you are today and notice how substantially different that person has become in ways both obvious and invisible to your daily awareness. This transformation is not something that happened to you at a single moment or across a defined period that you could point to on a calendar. Instead, it occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, through countless small interactions with the world, conversations with people who challenged your thinking, experiences that forced you to reconsider what you thought you knew, and quiet moments of reflection where you revised your understanding of yourself and others. The evolution continues right now as you lie here, as every conversation you have and every book you read and every moment of struggle or joy reshapes the neural pathways in your brain, altering how you perceive reality and respond to it. This is happening at both a biological level, where your cells are constantly replacing themselves, and your brain is continuously forming new connections while pruning away old ones that no longer serve you, and at a psychological level, where your personality, values, and perspective continue to shift based on accumulated experience and reflection. The mechanism behind this evolution is fundamentally tied to how consciousness works and how humans learn, for your brain is not a static object that was completed at some point in your development and remains fixed thereafter. Rather, it is a dynamic system designed by nature itself to adapt and change in response to your environment and experiences, continuously reorganizing itself in response to new information and challenges. What is remarkable is that despite understanding this truth logically, many people move through life as though they should already be finished, as though they should have all the answers now and should not need to change further. We have somehow normalized the idea that maturity means reaching a destination, rather than understanding that maturity is itself a process of continued evolution and growth. Yet the reality remains that you are not the same person you were yesterday, and you will not be the same person tomorrow, and this constant state of becoming is not something to resist or fear, but rather something to surrender to with gentleness and acceptance. When you stop fighting this fundamental nature of your being and instead lean into it with curiosity rather than resistance, you open yourself to the possibility that who you are becoming might be far more interesting and capable than who you thought you needed to be, and that the person you will be next year is already waiting to teach you things about yourself that your current self cannot yet imagine. Perhaps this is why the most alive people you know are not those who have mastered life, but those who remain endlessly curious about it, who treat each day as an invitation to discover something new about themselves and the world, who understand that the uncertainty of their own becoming is not a flaw in their existence, but rather the very thing that makes it worth living. And so the question worth asking yourself is not, am I evolving enough, or have I become who I'm supposed to be? But rather, am I paying attention to my own becoming? Because awareness itself is the soil in which meaningful transformation grows, and the moment you begin to notice how you're changing, the old reactions you're releasing, the new compassion you're developing, the fears you're slowly outgrowing, you shift from being passively shaped by life to actively participating in your own emergence. This is the work of a lifetime, not the grim labor of self-improvement, but the gentle, ongoing practice of witnessing yourself with curiosity as you become someone new with each season, each relationship, each challenge you choose to face rather than flee from. Consider the ordinary morning when you wake and notice the quality of light filtering through your window, the way it transforms dust particles into something almost luminous, or how you pause for just a few seconds longer than usual to listen to the sound of birds outside before the day demands your attention. These are moments that serve no productive purpose, that accomplish nothing measurable, and yet they somehow shape the texture of an entire day in ways that are difficult to articulate but profoundly felt. When you think back on your life years later, you will rarely remember the major achievements or the grand events with the same clarity and emotional resonance as you remember these small, seemingly insignificant instances of connection, beauty, or unexpected kindness. A conversation with a stranger on a train, the taste of a particular meal shared with someone you care about, the feeling of accomplishment after completing a small task you had been avoiding, or simply the realization that someone thought of you during their day are the threads from which the fabric of a meaningful existence is actually woven. The human mind has evolved in such a way that our sense of well-being and satisfaction is not determined primarily by the magnitude of our successes or the impressiveness of our accomplishments, but rather by the accumulation of these small, often overlooked moments that create a sense of continuity, purpose, and connection in our daily lives. Yet despite this fundamental truth about how human happiness actually works, we continue to structure our entire existence around the pursuit of large goals and major milestones, constantly delaying our sense of satisfaction to some future point when we will have achieved enough or acquired enough or become enough. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that it barely registers as strange to us anymore, that we spend our finite time and energy chasing destinations while overlooking the actual landscape of our lives unfolding around us in real time. The small moments matter not because they contribute to some larger narrative or because they can be converted into status or currency, but because they are life itself, the actual experience of being alive, and recognizing this truth allows you to finally rest into the present moment without constantly evaluating it against some imagined future state of completion. When you walk outside and feel the warmth of sunlight on your skin, or when you catch yourself laughing genuinely at something small, you are not preparing for life, you are living it, and that distinction is everything. This is the freedom that comes from finally understanding that the destination was never the point. The walking itself, with all its ordinary details and unhurried observations, was always what it meant to be human. Once you begin to notice this shift in awareness, you will find that the quality of your attention becomes the primary currency of your life, more valuable than any external achievement, and you will discover that the moments you thought were empty spaces between important events were actually the main event all along. The parent who puts down their phone to really listen to their child's rambling story, the worker who takes a genuine interest in a colleague's struggle, the person who notices they are alive right now and lets that be enough. These are the ones who understand that meaning is not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized in the texture of ordinary days, and this recognition itself becomes the most profound achievement of all. And so the practice becomes simple, to move through your day with the understanding that every conversation, every pause, every small act of attention is the actual substance of a life well lived, not a distraction from it, and to trust that this shift in perception, from constantly reaching toward some distant finish line to fully inhabiting the present one, is perhaps the most important arrival you will ever make. Think about the last time you walked into a room with complete certainty about what you needed, only to stand there moments later with absolutely no recollection of your purpose, your mind a complete blank slate where your intention had been just seconds before. You might have felt a flash of frustration or embarrassment, that peculiar sensation of your own mind betraying you in the most mundane moment. Yet this experience is so universally shared that it has become the subject of countless jokes and the backdrop of daily life for nearly every person who has ever existed. We forget names of people we have met dozens of times. We forget why we opened a particular application on our phones. We forget the threads of conversations we were in the middle of having. And we forget entire years of our lives with such completeness that those periods feel almost unreal when we later attempt to recall them. The human memory is not designed as a perfect recording device, but rather as a selective system that prioritizes certain information while naturally and inevitably allowing other information to fade into the background, a process so fundamental to how our brains function that neurologists and psychologists have spent decades studying the mechanisms behind this forgetting. Our brains contain roughly 86 billion neurons, and the connections between these neurons, the synapses, form and reform based on what information we encode and how frequently we access that information, which means that memories quite literally require maintenance and repeated activation in order to persist, and those memories we do not regularly access gradually weaken until they become inaccessible, not because we have done anything wrong, but because our brains are simply following their natural biological programming. Yet despite understanding this mechanism, despite knowing with absolute certainty that forgetting is a completely normal and necessary function of human cognition, we still experience shame or frustration when we forget something, still berate ourselves for not remembering a fact or a name or a promise we made, still feel as though there is something wrong with us personally when our minds fail to retrieve information on demand. We have built an entire society around the assumption that perfect memory is a reasonable expectation, that forgetting is a failure rather than a feature, and that any lapse in remembering reflects poorly on our competence or our character, when in reality forgetting is simply what human brains do, what they have always done, and what they must do in order to function at all. The relaxation that comes from accepting this truth lies not in pretending you will never forget anything, but in understanding that when you do forget, you are not defective or inadequate, you are simply human, and that this has always been true and will continue to be true for every person you have ever known or ever will know. The next time you forget something, you might pause before reaching for self-criticism and instead recognize that moment as evidence of your membership in the human experience, a small reminder that your brain is working exactly as it was designed to work, prioritizing what matters most and releasing what no longer serves you. In this way, forgetting becomes not a weakness to overcome, but a feature of a mind that is constantly evolving, making space for new experiences, and allowing you to move forward unburdened by the weight of every detail you have ever encountered. Perhaps the goal, then, is not to remember everything, but to forgive yourself for remembering so little. And in that forgiveness lies a kind of freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, to be present in this moment rather than haunted by what you cannot recall, and to recognize that the most meaningful memories are not those we cling to desperately, but those we return to again and again because they matter, because we choose to keep them alive through the simple act of remembering them together. Consider the remarkable fact that you have been breathing continuously since the moment you were born, and for the vast majority of that time, you have given it virtually no conscious thought whatsoever. Right now, as you lie in bed preparing to sleep, your body is orchestrating the complex mechanical dance of inhalation and exhalation without requiring a single instruction from your conscious mind. Your diaphragm contracts and expands, your lungs fill and empty, your oxygen levels remain perfectly balanced, and carbon dioxide is efficiently expelled, all while you are completely unaware of the process occurring within you. This automation is so complete and so seamless that you could spend an entire lifetime never once thinking about the act of breathing, and yet it would continue its steady rhythm regardless of your attention or intention. The autonomic nervous system, that ancient part of your brain that controls all the functions necessary for survival, has taken full responsibility for this essential task. Your medulla oblongata, a small region at the base of your brain, constantly monitors the carbon dioxide levels in your blood and adjusts your breathing rate accordingly, speeding it up when you need more oxygen, slowing it down when your demands are minimal. This system is so well designed, so thoroughly refined by millions of years of evolution, that it requires no conscious supervision whatsoever. You do not need to remember to breathe when you fall asleep, just as you do not need to remind yourself to breathe while you are concentrating on work or lost in thought. The remarkable truth here is that this automatic system is so reliable, so fundamentally trustworthy, that your conscious mind is entirely freed from the burden of maintaining this vital function. You can direct your attention elsewhere, pursue your thoughts, engage with the world around you, all while your body loyally continues this ancient rhythmic dance without fail. There is something deeply comforting in recognizing that your survival does not depend on your vigilance or your memory, that some things are simply handled for you without your involvement or your worry. Your breath continues whether you think about it or not, whether you are confident or anxious, whether you remember it exists or forget it entirely. This is one of the great mercies of being human, one of the fundamental gifts of having a body that knows how to care for itself. And yet, paradoxically, the moment you become aware of your breathing, the instant you shift your attention to the rise and fall of your chest, the automatic process often becomes uncertain, hesitant, as if your conscious mind's interference disrupts the very perfection it was admiring. This strange phenomenon reveals a profound truth. Some of life's most essential functions thrive precisely because we do not watch them, do not question them, do not try to improve upon the wisdom that evolution has already perfected. So as you settle into sleep tonight, allow your breathing to recede back into the darkness of automaticity, trusting in the ancient wisdom of your body to maintain this essential rhythm without the interference of your watchful mind. In this surrender to what is automatic, you may find a deeper rest than any conscious effort could ever provide. Let this be your model for sleep itself, another automatic process that resists conscious control, another gift that arrives most fully when you stop trying to seize it and simply allow it to unfold at its own pace. Your heartbeat, your digestion, your immune system, all of these operate with the same magnificent indifference to your conscious awareness, each one a testament to the body's capacity to sustain itself without your interference or oversight. In learning to trust your breathing, you learn to trust the entire intricate symphony of systems that have kept you alive since birth, asking nothing of you but the simple gift of surrender. Every single night when you close your eyes and surrender to sleep, your body embarks on an intricate journey of restoration that rivals the most sophisticated repair operations in nature. And this process unfolds in the darkness with such profound purpose that it touches nearly every system within you, from the smallest cellular structures to the largest organizational networks that govern your consciousness and physical function. Consider what happens during these hours of rest. Your brain consolidates memories, sorting through the vast accumulation of experiences and information gathered throughout your waking day, deciding which moments deserve to be preserved in long-term storage and which can be safely discarded as unnecessary noise, a process that is absolutely essential for learning and growth and the fundamental maintenance of your cognitive abilities. Simultaneously, your body initiates countless repair mechanisms that address the wear and tear inflicted during your active hours, as damaged proteins are broken down and rebuilt with fresh precision, as cellular debris is cleared away, as tissues that have been stressed and strained are restored to their optimal function through the orchestration of countless biological processes that operate with meticulous attention to detail. Your immune system strengthens during sleep, producing and distributing the antibodies and immune cells that protect you from illness, which explains why you become more vulnerable to sickness when you are chronically sleep-deprived and why adequate rest is one of the most powerful preventive medicines available to you. Your muscles recover and grow stronger, your nervous system recalibrates itself, your emotional regulation centers reset, allowing you to approach the next day with greater resilience and stability, and your entire endocrine system rebalances itself, restoring the proper hormonal equilibrium that influences everything from your mood to your metabolism to your capacity for emotional regulation and rational decision-making. Yet despite having such overwhelming scientific evidence of sleep's restorative power, modern culture continues to treat sleep as an inconvenient necessity rather than as the profound healing practice that it truly is. And we have somehow normalized the glorification of exhaustion, celebrating those who sacrifice sleep in pursuit of productivity as though they have discovered some secret pathway to excellence. When in reality, they are only degrading the very biological systems that enable genuine excellence in the first place. The truth is that sleep is not lost time but invested time, a sacred negotiation between your present self and your future self where you trade hours of consciousness for days of genuine capability. And when you finally grant your body the rest it desperately needs, you discover that you do not lose productivity, you reclaim it, along with the clarity, creativity, and resilience that only true restoration can provide. So tonight, when you lie down to sleep, understand that you are not simply resting. You are participating in one of the most consequential acts of self-care available to you, a nightly investment in your own repair and renewal that will determine not just how you feel tomorrow, but who you become across the months and years of your life. When you honor sleep as the essential repair mechanism it is, you grant yourself permission to heal from the accumulated stress, heartbreak, and disappointment that daily life inevitably brings, and you acknowledge that restoration is not luxury but necessity, not weakness but wisdom. Your body does not distinguish between the physical damage of a long day and the emotional wounds of a difficult conversation. It repairs both with equal dedication, mending not just muscles and neurons, but also the frayed edges of your spirit, so that each morning you wake not merely rested, but genuinely renewed. This is why the most powerful act of rebellion against a culture that demands constant productivity is simply to sleep deeply and without guilt, allowing yourself to be repaired night after night until you become whole again. There exists a peculiar certainty in the human experience that operates beneath almost every moment of our waking and sleeping lives, a certainty so fundamental that we rarely pause to examine it, and yet it shapes the entire architecture of how we move through time and organize our consciousness. This certainty is the knowledge that tomorrow will arrive, that the sun will rise again, that another day will come whether we prepare for it or not, whether we desire it or whether we dread it with every fiber of our being. We have built our entire civilization on this assumption, constructing calendars and clocks and schedules based entirely on the unwavering premise that time will continue to move forward in its linear progression, that tonight will give way to morning, that this moment will transform into the next moment and the moment after that. When we lie in bed at night, anxious about something that happened during the day or worried about what might happen in the days ahead, there remains this deeper layer of our consciousness that knows with absolute certainty that time will not stop, that the earth will continue its rotation, that regardless of our emotional state or our circumstances or the problems we face, the hours will pass and a new day will eventually arrive. This is not something we learn through instruction or through reading about physics and astronomy, though we certainly understand these mechanisms intellectually. Rather, it is something we have experienced repeatedly since the moment we became conscious enough to understand the concept of time, a pattern that has never once been violated in our entire lives, a consistency that our brains have encoded so deeply that it becomes almost invisible to us. When we struggle with insomnia or when our minds race with concerns about the future, this truth sits quietly beneath all the turbulence, offering a kind of anchor that we often fail to recognize. The anxiety itself acknowledges this truth implicitly, because we worry about tomorrow specifically, because we know tomorrow will come and will bring with it the situations we fear or the responsibilities we dread. But in that acknowledgement lies a hidden comfort, because if tomorrow will come regardless, then there is nothing to be done about its arrival through worry or resistance. The sun has risen every single morning of our lives without exception, and though we understand rationally that eventually this will not be true, that eventually our personal experience of sunrises will end, this is an abstraction so far removed from our current moment that it has almost no bearing on the fundamental truth that tomorrow will come. This persistence of tomorrow, this absolute reliability of time's forward motion, is perhaps one of the few things in life that requires absolutely nothing from us in order to happen, that does not depend on our effort or our achievement or our worth as human beings. We cannot earn tomorrow through good behavior, nor can we lose it through failure, and yet we live as though we must constantly prove ourselves worthy of the time that is given to us. The paradox is that this truth, while providing genuine comfort when we truly absorb it, somehow coexists within us alongside profound anxiety about what tomorrow might bring, and we have normalized this simultaneous holding of two seemingly contradictory states, as though it is simply the natural condition of human consciousness. There is a restfulness available in releasing the thought that we must do something to ensure tomorrow arrives, that we must prepare ourselves or prove ourselves or become something different, because tomorrow will come precisely as it is meant to come, inevitable and patient, waiting for no one and requiring nothing. And perhaps this is why in our darkest moments, when the weight of the present feels unbearable, we find ourselves whispering to ourselves or to others the simple refrain that time will pass, that this too shall change, that we need only endure until the next sunrise arrives to carry us forward into a version of ourselves we cannot yet imagine. When you find yourself in the depths of night, lying awake in the profound blackness that surrounds you, it can feel as though the darkness might persist forever, as though the sun has somehow forgotten to return, as though you have entered a state of permanent twilight from which there is no escape. The silence is complete, the world outside your window appears entirely devoid of light, and the hours seem to stretch on endlessly in that thick, heavy darkness that presses against everything you can sense. Yet invariably, without fail, without exception, the dawn always comes. The darkness always gives way to light. The morning always arrives, bringing with it the warmth of the sun and the restoration of visibility to the world around you, reminding you that what felt eternal and unchanging was actually temporary and cyclical. This is not a metaphor constructed by philosophers or poets, though it has been used as one countless times throughout human history. This is a literal astronomical fact, a physical reality that has repeated itself for billions of years and will continue to repeat itself for billions of years more, governed by the rotation of the Earth and its orbit around the sun. The night comes, the darkness descends, and then the light returns, every single time, without exception, without variation. The mechanism behind this truth is extraordinarily simple and yet somehow deeply comforting to contemplate. The Earth rotates on its axis at a consistent speed, and as it does, different portions of its surface face away from the sun and toward the sun in a predictable mathematical rhythm. When your location on Earth faces away from the sun, you experience night. When it faces toward the sun again, you experience day. There is no chaos in this system, no unpredictability, no moment in which the sun fails to return. The darkness that feels so absolute and so consuming is merely the result of your position in space relative to a star that continues to burn with the same steady constancy it has maintained for approximately 4.6 billion years. It is physics. It is geometry. It is the inevitable consequence of celestial mechanics operating exactly as they have always operated. And yet, despite this clarity, despite this absolute certainty, many people in the depths of nighttime experience a subtle fear, a quiet anxiety that whispers to them that perhaps this time might be different, that perhaps the dawn might not come, that perhaps they have somehow entered a state outside the normal cycle of the world. This feeling persists even in the minds of people who intellectually know with absolute certainty that the dawn will come. The anxiety persists because human consciousness evolved in an environment where darkness genuinely represented danger, where the inability to see clearly meant genuine vulnerability to predators and hazards. Our brains are still calibrated to a world where nighttime meant genuine peril, and so even though our conscious minds understand the safety of modern civilization and the absolute reliability of the rotating Earth, our deeper instincts still register the darkness as a potential threat, still carry within them the ancient warning systems that our ancestors needed to survive. And yet the dawn comes anyway, the light returns, the cycle continues, the darkness recedes. And this has been the pattern of existence since before humanity existed and will continue long after humanity ceases to exist. What comfort can be drawn from this knowledge is that your current darkness, whatever form it takes, whether literal sleeplessness or metaphorical struggle, is not a permanent state, but rather a phase in an inevitable cycle, a predictable rotation that will bring you again into the light, just as it has brought countless others through their own nights of despair and uncertainty toward mornings of renewed hope and clarity. The person who lies awake convinced their depression will never lift, the one who believes their grief is permanent, the one who fears their circumstances are unchangeable, each of them is simply experiencing their own night, and like all nights, it will. Consider for a moment the profound reality that the physical body you inhabited 10 years ago no longer exists in any material sense. For nearly every cell that composed your form at that distant point in time has been replaced entirely with new cells that have grown and divided and taken their place in the intricate architecture of your being. The human body exists in a state of perpetual renewal, where cells are constantly dying and being replaced through a process so gradual and seamless that we move through our lives without ever feeling the fundamental transformation that occurs within us moment by moment, day by day, year by year. The cells that make up your skin replace themselves approximately every 2 to 4 weeks, shedding constantly and invisibly as new cells push upward from the deeper layers to replace them, while the cells lining your digestive tract regenerate every 3 to 5 days, requiring your body to produce hundreds of millions of new cells daily just to maintain the basic structures that allow you to process food and survive. Red blood cells, those tireless carriers of oxygen that sustain every living tissue, last approximately 120 days before being broken down and replaced by new cells generated in your bone marrow. And your entire skeleton, that framework that seems so permanent and unchanging, renews itself over the course of roughly 7 to 10 years, with old bone tissue being broken down and new bone tissue being constructed in an ongoing process of maintenance and regeneration. The mechanism behind this cellular renewal is rooted in the nature of cells themselves, which are not eternal or unchanging structures, but rather temporary vessels that serve their functions and then must be replaced. And your body has evolved with extraordinary precision to identify when cells have aged or been damaged, and to initiate their removal and replacement with fresh, functioning cells that can maintain your health and vitality. This process is guided by your genes, which contain the instructions for how cells should divide and how often they should be replaced, and by your immune system and various regulatory mechanisms that monitor the condition of existing cells and signal when new ones are needed. The remarkable aspect of this system is that your body accomplishes this feat with such efficiency and invisibility that you remain essentially the same person throughout your life, maintaining your identity and continuity of self even as the physical substance that comprises your body is entirely different from what it was years ago. And you likely never think about this transformation because it happens beyond the threshold of your conscious awareness. Yet despite the logical reality of this constant renewal, and despite the fact that every person alive is experiencing this transformation continuously, we still hold to the assumption that our bodies are stable and fixed, that we are the same as we were, and that change is something that happens only to other people or in marked, obvious ways, when in truth we are all engaged in a constant process of becoming new versions of ourselves, cell by cell, and this knowledge, understood deeply in the twilight hours before sleep claims you, offers a strange comfort, for if your cells can renew themselves so completely and continuously, then so can you, in whatever way you need to become. The habits you practice today, the thoughts you cultivate, the nourishment you provide your body, these are not locked into unchanging neural pathways or cellular destinies, but rather are being written and rewritten into your very being with each passing day, each decision, each moment of conscious choice, and this perpetual malleability of your physical self suggests that transformation is not something to be hoped for someday, but rather something already occurring within you right now. The question then becomes not whether you can change, but whether you will consciously direct that change, whether you will tend to your renewal with intention rather than leaving it to chance and habit. There exists a peculiar condition within the human experience where we find ourselves perpetually situated in a moment that feels simultaneously insufficient and temporary, a present instant that seems to exist only as a bridge toward some future state that we believe will finally contain the qualities we currently lack. You wake in the morning, and instead of inhabiting the actual experience of waking, of feeling your body transition from sleep to consciousness, of noticing the light entering your room or the sounds of the world beginning its day, you immediately project yourself forward into the tasks that await, the obligations that demand your attention, the goals that remain unfulfilled. The breakfast you eat becomes merely fuel for the day ahead rather than a collection of flavors and textures worth your genuine presence. The conversation with someone you care about becomes background noise to your internal preoccupation with problems you need to solve or achievements you need to pursue. The walk through your neighborhood becomes a means of transportation rather than an opportunity to observe the specific quality of light in this particular season, to notice which plants are blooming, to feel the temperature of the air on your skin. This condition operates through a mechanism that we might call temporal displacement, a systematic habit of consciousness that diverts attention away from the present moment and directs it instead toward a future state that we imagine will be qualitatively different and superior. The mechanism works through a simple formula. We identify something we believe is missing from our current situation, we identify a future point in time when that absence will supposedly be remedied, and we spend our actual living time in anticipation of that remediation rather than in direct contact with what currently exists. When you feel insufficiently successful, you delay your sense of okayness until you receive a promotion. When you feel your life lacks romance, you postpone your ability to feel satisfied until you meet the right person. When you feel your body is inadequate, you defer your self-acceptance until you achieve the physical transformation you imagine will finally make you worthy of your own approval. Each of these future moments functions as a kind of psychological escape hatch, a place you can mentally retreat to when the present moment feels uncomfortable or incomplete. The logical problem with this mechanism is elementary, and yet remains remarkably invisible to most people despite its obvious nature. The future moment you are waiting for will arrive, and when it does, it will also be a present moment, which means it will have all the same qualities as this one. It will contain some satisfactions and some dissatisfactions, some experiences that feel complete and others that feel incomplete, some aspects that seem worth your attention and others that seem like obstacles to your attention. You will stand in that promoted position and discover that your consciousness has learned how to feel inadequate even there. You will meet the person you believed would complete you and find that the meeting itself has a complicated texture that does not match the imagined version. You will achieve the physical transformation and notice that your self-judgment has found new categories for criticism. The future never stops being the future, never stops being a present moment that your conditioned mind will find reasons to consider insufficient. Yet we continue to structure our actual time, the only time we actually possess and experience, around the pursuit of moments that will never be different from this one in the way we hope they will be. What makes this condition particularly normalized is that it has become almost entirely invisible as a condition at all. We treat the postponement of our own okayness as a rational response to life's legitimate demands, a sensible strategy rather than a systematic erosion of the only actual existence we have access to. We educate children to delay gratification and call it wisdom. There exists within the human experience a peculiar paradox where we simultaneously feel profoundly isolated in our struggles while being surrounded by countless others experiencing nearly identical feelings of loneliness and disconnection. And this contradiction persists even though we possess overwhelming evidence that our internal battles are shared across the entire spectrum of human consciousness. When you lie awake at night wrestling with thoughts of inadequacy, doubting your worth, questioning your decisions, or feeling the weight of anxiety pressing against your chest, there are millions of other people in this exact moment doing precisely the same thing in their own beds scattered across the world. Yet somehow this knowledge rarely penetrates the fog of our personal despair, because our minds have evolved to focus intensely on our own experience at the expense of recognizing the universality of human suffering. The mechanism behind this isolation is rooted partly in biology and partly in the structure of modern life itself. As our brains develop to prioritize individual survival and threat detection, making it natural for us to assume that our particular pain or shame is somehow unique to us, somehow more shameful or unusual than what others experience. When in fact the specific details might change, but the fundamental emotions remain remarkably consistent across all people, regardless of background or circumstance. We have constructed a world where people present carefully curated versions of themselves to others, where vulnerability is often perceived as weakness rather than authenticity, where social media displays only the highlights rather than the struggles, and this performative existence reinforces the illusion that everyone else has figured things out while we alone remain stuck, confused, or broken in ways we cannot adequately express. And yet, despite possessing countless testimonies, studies, and shared stories that confirm our universal struggle with fear, doubt, failure, and loneliness, we somehow persist in believing that our particular experience is somehow different, somehow more isolating, somehow more deserving of our shame, and this stubborn persistence of loneliness, despite rational evidence to the contrary, reveals something profound about how powerfully our subjective experience overrides objective truth. How our individual consciousness remains the most compelling reality we know, and how deeply we crave authentic connection even as we unknowingly sabotage it through the very shame and secrecy that keeps us separated from the recognition that every single person around you is navigating their own version of this same dark forest. The antidote to this isolation is not simply knowing intellectually that others suffer. It is the courageous act of speaking your truth to another person, of allowing yourself to be seen in your imperfection, because it is only through this vulnerable exposure that the illusion shatters, and you discover that the person listening is not recoiling in judgment, but rather recognizing themselves in your confession, nodding with the relief of finally being understood. When you finally risk sharing that fear you've carried in silence for years, or admit the mistake you thought would define you forever, you often find that the person across from you exhales, as if a weight they didn't know they were carrying has also been lifted. And in that shared moment of recognition, the isolation that felt so absolute just moments before begins to dissolve into the profound comfort of being truly known. This is why a single conversation can fundamentally alter your perception of reality, not because the facts of your situation have changed, but because you have finally witnessed another human being reflect back to you the truth that your struggle is not a personal failure, but a shared condition of being alive. And this recognition is often the first step toward both self-compassion and genuine connection with others who have been waiting in their own silence for permission to be imperfect alongside you. Consider for a moment the remarkable biological reality that exists within every living human being. Your heart beats independently, without any instruction from your conscious mind, continuing its rhythmic work whether you are awake or asleep, whether you are thinking about it or completely unaware of its existence, and this singular organ maintains its own timing, its own pace, its own mysterious schedule that remains fundamentally separate from the rest of your body's voluntary systems. You cannot simply decide to beat your heart faster through willpower alone in the way you might decide to raise your arm or speak a word, because your heart operates on a level of autonomy that your conscious brain does not govern, and this creates a peculiar kind of separation between the you that thinks and decides and the you that simply continues to live. The heart has its own nervous system, a sophisticated network of neurons sometimes called the cardiac brain, which processes information independently and makes adjustments based on subtle chemical signals and electrical impulses that occur entirely beneath the threshold of your awareness. This means that even in your most isolated moments, even when you feel utterly alone in the world, your heart is communicating with itself, regulating itself, maintaining its own conversation with your body that exists completely separate from your thoughts and feelings and conscious experiences. The psychological mechanism behind this reality is profound because it represents a fundamental truth about existence itself. That no matter how connected we believe ourselves to be with others, no matter how dependent we feel on external validation or presence or love, there remains within each of us a core biological function that is irreducibly solitary, that cannot be shared or transferred or truly merged with another person. Your heart beats alone in the literal sense, but it also beats alone in the metaphorical sense, because every heartbeat is uniquely yours, generated by your own body's requirements, shaped by your own genetic code, responding to your own circumstances and stresses and joys. We have normalized this fundamental aloneness so completely that we rarely pause to acknowledge how strange and beautiful it truly is. How each person walking this earth carries within them this steadfast companion that is both intimately known and eternally mysterious. This organ that will beat its final beat long after consciousness fades. That represents the most basic contract between self and survival, between the individual body and the individual life it sustains. In the quiet darkness before sleep, as you become increasingly aware of your own bodily sensations, you may find yourself noticing the faint awareness of your heartbeat, that steady percussion underlying everything you experience, and in that moment you can recognize a profound truth. That you are fundamentally and beautifully alone in the most essential sense, that your life is your own rhythm, your own pace, your own singular journey through time, and that this aloneness is not something to fear, but something to recognize as the foundation of all authentic existence. When you place your hand over your heart and feel that pulse beneath your palm, you're touching the boundary between your inner world and the outer world, acknowledging the truth that this most vital rhythm belongs only to you, and no other person, no matter how close, can ever truly feel the exact cadence of your individual survival the way you do in that moment of quiet recognition. And perhaps this is why the phrase, "my heart goes out to you," rings with such poignant truth. We recognize instinctively that while our hearts beat alone, they somehow reach across the distance to acknowledge another's solitary rhythm, creating a paradoxical connection between two irreducibly separate lives. A bridge built from the recognition that we are each fundamentally, eternally, and irreplaceably alone in the most human way possible. Consider the most abandoned places on Earth, the cities that have been left behind by human civilization, the forests that have been cleared and stripped bare, the deserts that have been scarred by industry and extraction. Walk through the ruins of Pripyat near Chernobyl, where nature has reclaimed entire apartment buildings with vines and roots breaking through concrete, where wolves now roam streets that once bustled with human activity, where trees grow through the roofs of schools and hospitals as if the earth itself is breathing life back into the spaces we left behind. Observe how quickly a garden becomes wild when we stop tending to it, how moss creeps across sidewalks we poured just decades ago, how seeds carried by wind and animals find their way into the smallest cracks and patiently wait for their moment to grow. This is not metaphor but observable fact. Nature does not disappear when we turn away from it or cover it with asphalt and steel, but rather it waits with infinite patience at the margins, in the spaces between our constructions, ready to expand into any absence we create. The psychological mechanism behind this truth is that we have grown accustomed to seeing ourselves as separate from nature, as beings who can conquer and control the natural world through our ingenuity and force. Yet this separation is an illusion born from our recent technological advances and our ability to temporarily suppress the natural world within our immediate surroundings. What actually happens is far simpler. Life is persistent, adaptive, and fundamentally driven by the same forces that have been reshaping the Earth for billions of years, and our temporary dominance is merely a brief interruption in a story far longer and more patient than our individual lifespans. We have normalized the idea that we can permanently alter landscapes, permanently eliminate species, permanently prevent nature from returning, and we have built entire economic systems on this assumption, extracting resources as if they are infinite and abandoning land as if it is truly dead. Yet every hurricane that tears through a city reminds us that weather patterns existed long before our buildings. Every forest fire followed by new growth shows us that destruction contains within it the seeds of renewal. Every time a river floods its banks despite our dams and barriers, we are reminded that water follows the same ancient paths it has always followed, finding its way downhill through gravity and persistence. The comfort in this truth lies not in denying our impact or pretending human influence is insignificant. but in recognizing that the Earth's life force is far more resilient and powerful than any single species or civilization can suppress indefinitely, that what we have broken can heal, that what we have abandoned will eventually transform into something wild and living again. And that this process is not punishment, but simply the continuation of a pattern that has existed since life first emerged from the oceans. In this way, nature's return is not a distant promise, but an active process happening now, in the rewilding projects across Europe, where wolves and lynx move through forests reclaimed from farmland, in the coral reefs that recover when we stop poisoning the waters around them, in the indigenous lands where traditional stewardship allows ecosystems to flourish in ways our extraction-based management never could. To witness nature's return is to understand that our role need not be dominion, but participation in a renewal that asks only for our restraint and our willingness to step back. This restraint is not surrender but recognition, a shift from asking, "How much can we take?" to asking, "What can we restore?" And in that single reframing lies the possibility of a future where human civilization and thriving ecosystems are not opposing forces, but partners in an ancient dance of growth, decay, and renewal that will continue long after we are gone. Consider the fundamental rhythm that governs the natural world around you, the inexorable turning of seasons that has persisted for billions of years without deviation or exception. The way winter inevitably transforms into spring, spring blooms into summer, summer fades into autumn, and autumn circles back to winter in an endless cycle that requires no permission, no negotiation, and no human intervention to proceed. This transformation happens with such regularity that we can predict it years in advance, marking our calendars with absolute certainty about when the leaves will change, when the snow will fall, when the flowers will emerge from frozen earth, and yet despite this perfect predictability, we often find ourselves caught off guard by the very changes we know are coming. The mechanism behind this seasonal rotation is rooted in the simple mathematics of planetary motion, the tilt of the Earth's axis as it orbits the Sun, creating different angles of solar radiation that gradually shift the temperature, humidity, and daylight hours across the globe in waves of change that move through their cycles regardless of our awareness or preparation. What makes this truth so psychologically soothing is that it operates entirely independently of human control, worry, or intention, proceeding forward with the kind of indifferent certainty that removes all burden of management from our shoulders. You do not need to make summer arrive, nor can you prevent autumn from coming, and this absence of responsibility carries with it a deep peace that we rarely acknowledge. The seasons demonstrate that major transformation happens naturally, gradually, and without any requirement for our intervention, showing us through their endless repetition that change itself is not something to fear, but rather something to expect as naturally as we expect to breathe. Despite knowing this truth intellectually, we often resist the seasonal shifts, preferring to cling to familiar weather and familiar rhythms. Yet the seasons change anyway, teaching us through their persistence that resistance to natural cycles is ultimately futile, and that acceptance brings greater ease than struggle. We have organized entire civilizations around these seasonal changes, developing agricultural practices, holidays, and cultural traditions that acknowledge and celebrate the turning year. Yet somehow we continue to be surprised when each season arrives, as if the reliability of natural cycles has not yet truly registered in our consciousness. The comfort in recognizing that seasons always change lies partly in understanding that nothing, including any difficult period you might currently experience, can remain static or eternal. For the same force that changes seasons will eventually change circumstances, moods, and situations into something entirely different. This truth persists in human awareness despite our modern attempts to insulate ourselves from seasonal variation through climate control and artificial environments, suggesting that the awareness of seasonal change touches something deeper in our minds than mere intellectual knowledge, speaking instead to an ancient recognition that has been encoded in human consciousness through countless generations who depended on seasonal patterns for survival. When you observe the persistent return of spring after the harshest winter, or watch summer's intensity inevitably give way to autumn's gentler rhythms, you are witnessing not merely a meteorological event, but a fundamental reassurance written into the fabric of existence itself. That cycles complete, that dormancy precedes renewal, and that the wheel of time turns with a patience and inevitability that asks nothing of us except to notice, and in noticing, to understand that we too are part of this larger pattern of transformation. When you find yourself in the grip of winter, whether literal or metaphorical, this remembered pattern of seasonal return becomes an anchor point for hope, a quiet certainty that the frozen ground will thaw, that life will emerge again, and that your current stillness is not an ending but merely a phase in an inevitable. Consider the vast expanse of sky above you on any given night, whether you're standing in a remote location far from city lights or gazing upward from your own backyard, and you will eventually come to understand a simple yet profound truth that has remained constant throughout human history. The stars are always there, even when you cannot see them. During the day, when sunlight floods the atmosphere and obscures our view of the cosmos, we might naturally assume that the stars have somehow disappeared or faded away, that they exist only in the darkness of night, waiting to be revealed once the sun has set and the world has grown quiet. This assumption feels intuitive because our experience is limited to what we can directly perceive with our eyes, and our perception is fundamentally dependent on the absence of competing light sources that overwhelm the faint glow of distant celestial bodies. Yet the scientific reality is far more constant and reassuring than our daily experience suggests. For those distant points of light continue their ancient vigil across the heavens, regardless of whether we are present to witness them, regardless of whether clouds obscure them, and regardless of whether the sun's overwhelming brilliance renders them invisible to our view. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is elegantly simple. Stars emit light continuously, steadily, reliably at the same moment, whether it is noon or midnight in your location, whether it is summer or winter, whether you are watching or not. The stars do not flicker in and out of existence based on our observation of them. Rather, they maintain their positions and their luminescence as permanent features of our universe, burning with the same constancy that has characterized them for billions of years. What changes is not the stars themselves, but only our ability to perceive them, our access to their light, our capacity to witness their presence as we rotate away from or toward them on this spinning world. There exists something deeply comforting in understanding that this constancy persists entirely independent of our attention or our needs, that the universe does not require our observation to maintain its structure, and that even in moments when we feel most isolated or when darkness seems absolute and overwhelming, those celestial lights continue their journey through space exactly as they have always done. This truth reminds us that many things in existence operate on a scale far larger and with a consistency far greater than the temporary anxieties and concerns that occupy our waking hours, and that this permanence and reliability exist whether we acknowledge them or remember to look for them. When you next find yourself beneath a daylit sky, you might pause to consider that directly overhead, in that apparently empty blue expanse, thousands of stars continue their silent burning, indifferent to the sun's dominance, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when darkness will make them visible once again to your watching eyes. And perhaps this understanding might shift how we perceive the night sky itself, not as a rare gift that appears only in darkness, but as a constant presence we are finally permitted to witness, a reminder that the universe's most enduring truths often exist quietly beyond the reach of our immediate awareness, asking only that we occasionally look upward to remember. In this way, the stars teach us that constancy need not announce itself, that reliability often operates in silence, and that some of the most profound truths about our existence are those we must actively choose to seek out rather than those that demand our immediate attention. The next time you witness a clear night sky, you might recognize it not as an event that occurs, but as a moment of clarity revealing what has always been present, a gentle invitation to align your awareness with the deeper rhythms of the universe that persist far beyond the boundaries of human perception or concern. Every single morning, without exception and without requiring any effort on your part, the sun rises above the horizon in a reliable and consistent manner that has continued for billions of years and will continue for billions of years more. A phenomenon so dependable that you can set your entire life around it and never once worry that it might fail to occur. The Earth rotates on its axis at a perfectly steady rate, completing one full rotation every 24 hours, and as your location on the planet turns to face the star at its center, light gradually floods across the landscape in a sequence of colors that moves from deep purple to soft blue to pale pink to brilliant gold, a progression so natural and so automatic that most people barely register it is happening. The sunrise requires nothing from you. It asks for no permission, demands no sacrifice, and shows no preference for whether you acknowledge it or ignore it entirely. The sun will rise tomorrow morning at almost exactly the same time it rose this morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, stretching forward into an infinite future where this repetition continues without interruption or variation. This constancy exists not because someone decided it should, but because the laws of physics and the mechanics of planetary motion operate with such perfect precision that deviation becomes impossible. You could sleep through every sunrise for the rest of your life, and they would still happen without complaint. You could refuse to believe in the sunrise, and it would still paint the sky with light. You could try to prevent the sunrise, and your effort would be so meaninglessly insignificant against the vastness of celestial mechanics that the sun would rise anyway, indifferent to your resistance. There is something profoundly soothing in recognizing that certain things in existence operate completely independent of human emotion, human approval, or human involvement. The sunrise does not care whether you find it beautiful or whether you find it ordinary. It does not accelerate if you wish it to or slow down if you prefer darkness. It simply continues its eternal cycle, providing light and warmth and structure to the planet with absolute reliability. You can rest knowing that when you wake tomorrow, there will be light. You can rest knowing that this pattern has held for billions of years and will hold for billions more. You can rest knowing that there is at least one thing in your life that requires absolutely nothing from you and yet continues to show up with perfect consistency, asking nothing in return except perhaps that you simply witness it, or perhaps not even that. In this way, the sunrise becomes a gift that requires no gratitude, a promise that needs no words, a certainty in a world where so much else remains uncertain and subject to change. You need only be alive to receive it. And in that simplicity, in the mere act of existing and witnessing, lies a kind of freedom that no other force in your life can offer you, a freedom that costs nothing and demands nothing, yet somehow makes everything else feel more bearable. When you watch the sunrise after a night of worry or pain, you are witnessing proof that the world will turn regardless of your suffering, that the cycle continues, that you will be carried forward into a new day whether you feel ready or not. This is not cruelty, it is mercy. And so when you find yourself overwhelmed by the weight of your own circumstances, you might consider stepping outside in those early hours to stand in the presence of something that has never once failed you, something that asks only that you exist to receive its light. And in that simple act of witnessing, remember that you too are part of a cycle far larger than your momentary suffering, carried forward by forces that care nothing for your doubt and everything for your continuation. The sunrise does not remember your failures from yesterday, nor does it carry grudges into tomorrow. It simply returns, again and again, offering each day as a fresh beginning that asks nothing of who you were before it arrived. When you stand at the shore and watch the waves, you are witnessing something far more profound than simple water in motion, for the ocean itself operates according to a rhythm that mirrors the breathing of living things, expanding and contracting in patterns so vast and so slow that human perception barely registers the movement at all. The tides rise and fall with the gravitational pull of the moon and sun, creating a systemic inhale and exhale that affects every cubic meter of water on Earth. But beneath this well-understood phenomenon lies something even more fundamental about how the ocean functions as a living system, one that actually does require gas exchange and circulation in ways that scientists have only recently begun to fully appreciate. The ocean's surface waters absorb oxygen from the atmosphere and release carbon dioxide, while deeper waters circulate through a process called thermohaline circulation, where cold, dense water sinks toward the ocean floor and warmer water rises to replace it, a process that moves water around the entire planet over centuries and ensures that oxygen reaches even the deepest trenches where life persists in ways we find almost miraculous. This circulation system is the ocean's actual breathing mechanism, far more complex than the simple tides, a global conveyor belt of water that must keep moving or the entire ecosystem begins to suffocate. Yet we have rarely talked about it in these terms, rarely acknowledged that when we warm the planet and disrupt these currents, we are quite literally restricting the ocean's ability to breathe and sustain the vast web of life that depends on its circulation. There is something deeply calming about recognizing that the ocean does not simply sit there as an inert container of water, but instead lives through the same fundamental requirement that all living systems share: the need to exchange gases and circulate life-giving resources throughout its body. And understanding this reality transforms how we might perceive the water when we encounter it, knowing that what feels like a timeless, eternal system is actually a delicate and dynamic process that has persisted for millions of years through the gentle rhythm of inhale and exhale, expansion and contraction. a breathing that has remained constant long before humans walked the earth and will hopefully continue long after, provided we learn to respect the lungs of our planet. When we listen to the sound of waves breaking on the shore, we might imagine we are hearing the ocean's breath, the exhale of water returning to land, and in a very real sense, we are witnessing one small part of a planetary respiration that has sustained all life on Earth since the beginning, a rhythm we ignore at our peril. The great ocean currents that encircle our planet, the Gulf Stream, the Kuroshio, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, are not mere geographic features but the pathways through which this vital respiration occurs, and when we measure their slowdown in recent decades, we are essentially listening to the ocean's breath becoming shallow and labored, a warning sign as unmistakable as any gasp for air. Just as we monitor a patient's breathing to assess their health, scientists now track ocean circulation patterns with increasing urgency, knowing that the slowing of these currents is not merely a statistical anomaly but a fundamental alteration of the planet's life support system, one that demands our immediate attention and collective action before the rhythm becomes too faint to recover. The coral reefs that bleach when waters warm too quickly, the dead zones that expand when circulation fails to flush out excess nutrients, the fish populations that collapse when oxygen-depleted waters spread. These are not separate crises but symptoms of a single suffocating condition, a planet whose oceans can no longer breathe as they once did. And in learning to hear this breath, we begin to understand that saving the ocean is not an act of charity but an act of survival. Consider for a moment the vast ocean that covers most of our planet, and the way its surface rises and falls with such predictable regularity that we can forecast these movements years in advance with remarkable accuracy. Every single day, in coastal regions across the world, the water moves in and out according to cycles so dependable that ancient peoples recognized them long before understanding their cause, and modern scientists can predict the exact time and height of tidal movements with precision that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. The tides follow patterns that repeat every 24 hours and 50 minutes, governed by the gravitational pull of the moon as it orbits our planet, and to a lesser extent by the gravitational influence of the sun, creating a system of such mathematical elegance that we can know with certainty when high tide will occur in any given location on any given day, sometimes months or even years into the future. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in fundamental physics, in the way gravity operates across space and pulls on massive bodies of water, creating bulges on the side of Earth facing the moon and on the opposite side as well, bulges that rotate around our planet as the moon orbits, generating the rising and falling motion that we observe along every coastline. What makes this pattern so profound and so deeply relaxing to contemplate is the realization that these movements happen not because of conscious intention or random chance, but because they follow laws of physics that are as reliable as the laws of mathematics itself. The tides will continue their rhythmic dance tomorrow and the day after and 1,000 years from now, independent of human awareness or concern, continuing in their established patterns with the kind of indifference that somehow feels deeply comforting rather than isolating. There is something profoundly soothing about observing a phenomenon so vast and so far beyond human control, something that operates according to principles that existed long before we arrived on this planet and will continue long after we depart. A reminder that the universe operates according to its own logic regardless of our participation, and that we can sometimes simply observe and accept the patterns that exist around us without needing to understand or change them. When we sit by the shore and watch the water advance and retreat, we are witnessing one of the most reliable demonstrations of cosmic order available to our immediate senses, a tangible connection to the moon's distant orbit and the mathematical precision underlying all natural phenomena. In this way, the tides become not merely a physical process to be studied, but an invitation to surrender to rhythms larger than ourselves, to find peace in patterns we did not create and cannot alter, yet can always depend upon. And perhaps this is why so many people find themselves drawn to the ocean during moments of uncertainty, seeking in its tidal rhythms a reassurance that some forces in life remain constant and knowable, that amid the chaos of human affairs there exists a natural order we can trust and return to again and again. The fisherman knows when to cast his net, the sailor adjusts his schedule to the water's rise and fall, and the child building sandcastles learns instinctively to work above the tide line, all of them participating, whether consciously or not, in a dance choreographed by celestial mechanics millions of years old, finding their own small rhythms within the ocean's greater pattern. And in learning to read these patterns, the spring tides that swell during full moons, the neap tides that diminish at quarter phases, we discover that patience and observation can reveal the hidden logic governing even the most dynamic natural systems, teaching us that understanding comes not from forcing answers, but from aligning ourselves with the rhythms that already exist. In this way, the tides teach us that mastery begins not with domination, but with recognition, with learning to work alongside forces far greater than ourselves rather than against them. Consider for a moment the simple reality of a tree's existence in the world around you, the oak or maple or pine that stands in a park near your home or perhaps along a quiet street where you walk. If you were to measure that tree today and then return in 1 year to measure it again, you would find that it has grown, yes, but the growth would be almost imperceptible to your eye, a fraction of an inch perhaps in height, a minimal widening of the trunk that you could barely detect with your hand. This is the fundamental truth about trees that we so often forget in our modern world of rapid transformation and instant gratification. Trees grow slowly, with a patience that spans years and decades and sometimes centuries, adding their rings year after year with the inevitability of seasons turning, but with a pace that asks nothing of us and demands nothing from us in return. The biological mechanisms at work are elegant and precise, involving the complex processes of photosynthesis, where leaves capture sunlight and convert it into energy, the intricate movement of nutrients and water through the vascular system of the plant, the deliberate allocation of resources toward root systems and branch structures, and the formation of new cells in the cambium layer that gradually expand the girth of the trunk while the tree reaches ever upward toward the sky. This slowness is not a limitation or a failure of the tree, but rather a perfectly calibrated strategy evolved over millions of years, one that allows the tree to build strong foundations and resilient structures capable of withstanding storms and droughts and the weight of seasons, and the slow growth itself creates the dense wood that gives the tree its strength and longevity. Yet in our contemporary existence, we have become so accustomed to speed and acceleration in nearly every aspect of our lives that the slowness of trees strikes us almost as foreign, as though growth should happen quickly and visibly and dramatically, as though the natural world should conform to our expectations of productivity and measurable progress. We watch films compressed into seconds that show a tree growing from seed to maturity, and we forget that this process in reality unfolds across decades or centuries, that the trees in ancient forests may have been growing since before we were born and will continue growing long after we are gone. The profound relaxation that comes from truly understanding this fact is the recognition that not everything requires speed, that some of the most valuable things in existence choose a path of patient, steady development, and that there is a rightness to this rhythm that has nothing to do with our modern compulsion toward instant results and immediate transformation. When we sit beneath the canopy of an old tree and feel the shade it provides, we are experiencing the accumulated gift of decades or centuries of this patient growth, a testament to the value of persistence that no rushed accomplishment could ever replicate. In learning to appreciate this slowness, we learn something essential about our own lives and the kind of legacy we might hope to build. Perhaps it is time we considered what we might accomplish in our own lives if we adopted this same patient philosophy, planting seeds of effort and intention today with the understanding that their full fruition may not arrive for years, trusting in the slow accumulation of small, deliberate actions that compound into something substantial and enduring. For in this way, the tree becomes not merely a botanical specimen but a teacher of wisdom, instructing us through its quiet persistence that the most meaningful achievements are those we tend carefully over time, watching them deepen and strengthen with each passing season until they become as solid and enduring as ancient wood. And just as the tree does not question whether its growth is fast enough, neither should we burden ourselves with the constant measurement of our progress, but instead trust in the organic unfolding of our own becoming, knowing that the roots we establish today will sustain the heights we reach tomorrow. Consider for a moment the extraordinary reality that unfolds beneath the soil and within the cellular structures of every plant on Earth, a process so fundamental to life itself that we rarely pause to acknowledge its profound nature. When you plant a seed in soil and water it, nothing visibly spectacular occurs for days, weeks, or even months, and yet beneath that quiet surface, an intricate cascade of biological transformation is taking place with absolute certainty and unwavering consistency. The seed absorbs moisture, its dormant embryo awakens from its patient slumber, roots begin to extend downward through the darkness of the soil, cellular division accelerates at a microscopic scale, and gradually a delicate shoot emerges searching for light without ever having seen the sun before. Most of this miraculous process happens in complete darkness, hidden from observation, unwitnessed by any eye, and yet it proceeds with perfect precision as if guided by an intelligence far older and more reliable than our conscious awareness. The roots that anchor a mature tree and draw nutrients from the earth were growing invisibly for years before we could see any sign of the massive canopy above, and this fundamental disconnection between what is happening and what is perceptible to our immediate senses reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself. The psychological mechanism underlying our relationship with plant growth relates to our deep evolutionary preference for visible change and immediate feedback, a preference that served our ancestors well when survival depended on detecting predators and observing the immediate consequences of their actions. We are creatures of the visible world, accustomed to seeing causes produce effects within timeframes our attention spans can register and our minds can process. Yet plant growth operates on a different temporal plane entirely, one that requires patience, trust, and a comfort with invisible processes that our impatient consciousness finds difficult to embrace. When we water a plant, we expect immediate transformation, yet the plant operates according to laws of chemistry and biology that have no obligation to match our expectations or timelines. And this mismatch creates a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance, where we intellectually understand that growth is happening even as our sensory experience suggests nothing at all is occurring. The roots of a 100-year-old oak were once invisible and fragile. The rings that mark a century of slow accumulation were laid down one by one in darkness, and yet we rarely contemplate this extraordinary fact even as we walk past these ancient giants every day of our lives. What is remarkable is that despite this complete invisibility, plants continue their patient work regardless of our attention or validation, a truth that should provide immense comfort and relief to anyone burdened by the weight of constant observation and the pressure to demonstrate progress visibly. Growth does not require an audience, transformation does not demand documentation, and the most significant changes in life often occur in the quiet spaces where no one is watching and nothing needs to be proven, a reality so counterintuitive to modern consciousness that we often miss its profound implications entirely. The seed germinates in solitude, the root system expands unmeasured, the internal architecture strengthens year after year, and when we finally notice the towering result, we are witnessing only the visible consequence of countless invisible decisions made by the plant in the dark, a humbling reminder that the most substantial achievements in any life, human or botanical, accumulate quietly beyond the reach of scrutiny or validation. Perhaps this is why the most transformative periods in human life, healing from illness, developing wisdom, cultivating genuine character, building the foundations of meaningful work, so often feel invisible while they are occurring, and why we only recognize their magnitude when we finally emerge into the light and can look back at the distance traveled in darkness. Consider the tree standing in the forest, the one that has weathered countless seasons and survived storms that toppled weaker growth around it, and you will begin to understand something profound about the nature of stability itself. For the roots of that tree extend far deeper into the soil than the visible trunk and branches suggest, reaching down into darkness where no eye can follow, spreading laterally through earth and stone to anchor the structure above with a strength that seems almost disproportionate to what we observe on the surface. This truth about roots growing deep operates as a fundamental principle not only in botany, but in every domain of human experience where we seek to build something that lasts, whether that construction is a career built over decades of patient work, a relationship deepened through years of consistent presence and care, a skill mastered through thousands of hours of deliberate practice, or a sense of personal stability founded upon experiences and lessons accumulated across the full span of a life. The mechanism underlying this truth is one of patient accumulation and the gradual establishment of unseen infrastructure, for roots do not grow deep overnight but rather extend themselves inch by inch, year after year, intertwining with the soil in ways that create redundancy and resilience, so that if one root system is damaged, others can compensate and distribute the burden. We understand intuitively that anything worth standing for must have foundations deeper than its visible aspects, yet we often act in ways that contradict this understanding, seeking rapid growth and immediate results rather than accepting the slower, quieter process of deepening our roots in whatever domains matter most to us. What makes this truth particularly soothing to contemplate as you prepare for sleep is the recognition that the deepest and most meaningful developments in our lives are happening in ways we cannot always see or measure in real time, much like the roots growing silently beneath the forest floor. And this realization releases us from the constant need to assess and validate progress through visible metrics. The roots grow deep regardless of whether we are monitoring their growth, regardless of whether we understand the mechanisms by which they strengthen. And this applies equally to the person working steadily toward a distant goal, the relationship quietly becoming more resilient through small accumulated acts of kindness and understanding, the body slowly adapting to regular exercise and nourishment, and the mind becoming more capable through patient study and reflection. There is profound rest to be found in knowing that the most important work often happens in the depths, in the slow accumulation of strength that goes unwitnessed and unsung, and that this underground development is precisely what allows us to weather the storms that inevitably come. As you drift towards sleep, allow yourself to release the urgency of visible progress and trust instead in the quiet work happening beneath the surface of your life, knowing that tomorrow you will wake to continue the patient, necessary work of deepening your roots, and that this invisible foundation is what will ultimately sustain you through whatever seasons lie ahead. The oak does not question whether its roots are growing strong enough. It simply continues the work of drawing nourishment from the earth, and in this simple persistence lies a wisdom we might do well to emulate, the understanding that our role is to show up consistently and tend to what matters, while the deepening itself unfolds according to its own natural timeline, asking only for our patient presence and steady care. So tonight, as you settle into rest, consider what roots you're tending in the soil of your own life, whether in relationships, work, health, or spirit, and know that the invisible strengthening happening in these depths is as real and consequential as any visible achievement, requiring only your continued presence and care to flourish across the seasons yet to come. Consider the simple yet profound reality that flowers do not bloom once in their lifetime and then cease to exist in that form, but rather return to bloom again and again, season after season, year after year, in an endless cycle of renewal that has persisted for millions of years across countless species and climates and geographical regions. When a flower completes its blooming cycle and the petals fall away and the plant appears to return to a dormant state, we might reasonably assume that this particular manifestation of beauty has ended permanently, that we have witnessed something precious and unrepeatable, something that will never return in quite the same way. Yet time passes and seasons shift, and the same plant that seemed to wither and fade begins to show new growth, new buds form along the branches, and within weeks or months the flowers emerge again, often nearly identical to their predecessors, equally vibrant and alive and full of the same intricate patterns and fragrances that characterized them before. This happens not once but repeatedly, sometimes many times within a single year depending on the species, and the plant expends the same energy and resources and biological effort to create these flowers each time as if it were being done for the first time. The mechanism behind this remarkable constancy is rooted in the plant's own evolved programming, the genetic instructions that survive dormancy and reset each season, prompting the plant to mobilize nutrients from its roots and stems and redirect them toward the creation of reproductive structures that will attract pollinators and ensure the continuation of the species. There is nothing mysterious about this at the biological level. It is simply what plants do. It is their nature encoded in their cellular memory, a process refined over eons of natural selection to be reliable and reproducible and efficient. Yet there is something deeply human about our tendency to treat each bloom as though it might be the last, to feel a quiet sense of surprise and gratitude when flowers return to the same garden, the same window box, the same vase month after month. We have normalized this endless return so thoroughly that we barely notice it. We take it entirely for granted. We cut flowers and bring them indoors without reflecting that next year at nearly this exact moment, if we do nothing but allow the plant to live, new flowers will emerge from seemingly dead wood and create beauty anew. The remarkable truth that offers such comfort to the weary mind is that nothing truly ends in nature, that renewal is not exceptional but rather the default state, that the universe seems fundamentally oriented toward repetition and return rather than permanent loss. And this orientation extends even to something as delicate and fleeting as a flower's bloom. This cyclical generosity of nature becomes a kind of promise we can rely upon, that what we love and lose to time may return to us in altered but recognizable form, that the garden teaches us to expect renewal rather than finality, and that in learning to notice the flowers that bloom again and again, we learn to trust in the possibility of our own return to wholeness after periods of dormancy and rest. When we tend a garden with this understanding, that what withers will return, that dormancy is not death, we begin to approach our own lives with less urgency and more patience, recognizing that the seasons of our own rest and renewal follow the same ancient rhythms that have governed the flowering of plants since life first emerged on land. We might begin to notice that the garden does not demand our perfection or constant vigilance, but only that we show up again and again, tending to what matters with the same patient consistency that the flower employs in its seasonal return, understanding that our own repeated efforts, imperfect as they may be, accumulate into something beautiful over time. In this way, the gardener and the garden become collaborators in a shared practice of gentle persistence, each returning season after season to participate in the same necessary work of growth and renewal. Every autumn, the trees around us begin their seasonal transformation, shedding countless leaves that drift to the ground in a gentle cascade of color and motion, covering sidewalks and lawns and parks in a thick blanket of gold and crimson and orange, and we watch this process with a sense of melancholy, observing the barren branches emerge as the last of the foliage falls away, leaving the trees looking skeletal and vulnerable against the gray sky. Yet this complete denudation of the canopy is not an ending, but rather a necessary pause, a deliberate withdrawal of energy and resources that the tree redirects inward, conserving moisture and protecting itself from the harsh conditions of winter that would otherwise drain its vitality and threaten its survival. The tree enters a state of dormancy that appears to us like death, a kind of biological hibernation where growth slows to an imperceptible rate and the visible signs of life seem to vanish entirely. But beneath the bark and within the root system, the tree remains very much alive, simply waiting and preparing for the renewal that science assures us will inevitably come. Come spring, without fail and with remarkable consistency, the buds appear along those same bare branches, swelling with potential and bursting forth into new leaves that are fresh and tender and full of possibility, leaves that are sometimes even more vibrant than those that fell the previous year, suggesting that the cycle itself generates renewal rather than merely repeating a pattern. This process persists year after year, decade after decade, century after century, independent of human observation or encouragement or understanding, a rhythm that continues whether we pay attention to it or not, whether we acknowledge its significance or dismiss it as mere biological mechanics. What makes this particularly soothing to contemplate is the absolute reliability of it, the way that despite every autumn appearing as though the trees might never recover, despite the seeming finality of bare branches against winter skies, the leaves return without exception, without negotiation, without any ambiguity about whether they will emerge again or in what form they might take. We have normalized this miracle so completely that we barely register it as remarkable, treating the return of spring foliage as an obvious inevitability rather than a profound statement about resilience and renewal, and the inherent design of natural systems toward continuation rather than conclusion. The tree asks nothing of us and requires no belief from us. It simply performs this cycle with absolute confidence, teaching us through its silent persistence that some things are genuinely reliable, that loss is genuinely temporary, and that return is not merely possible, but rather woven into the fundamental structure of how living systems operate. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves returning to trees during our own seasons of loss, seeking in their patient cycles a quiet reassurance that what has fallen away from us might also, in time, find its way back, or transform into something equally vital, equally alive. We see this hope reflected in how we speak of our own recoveries, the relationships we rebuild, the passions we rediscover, the versions of ourselves we thought were lost but somehow find our way back to, and in those moments, we are simply following the template that nature has been showing us all along, trusting in a rhythm older and wiser than our own despair. The leaf that falls in October is not gone. It is simply waiting in the soil, breaking down into nutrients that will feed next spring's growth, a literal transformation where yesterday's loss becomes tomorrow's nourishment, teaching us that return sometimes means becoming part of something larger than what we were before. And so when we stand beneath a tree in spring, watching new leaves unfurl from branches we thought were dead, we are witnessing not just botany but a fundamental truth about existence itself, that endings are always provisional, that dormancy is not death, and that the world is built on cycles of return. Every year across continents and oceans, billions of birds undertake one of nature's most extraordinary journeys, traveling thousands of miles from their summer breeding grounds to their winter homes and back again, guided by mechanisms so precise and instinctive that they navigate routes they have never consciously learned, following pathways etched into their very biology through millions of years of evolutionary refinement. These creatures, many weighing no more than a few grams, somehow possess an internal compass that responds to the Earth's magnetic field, combined with the ability to read the positions of stars, the angle of the sun, and the subtle cues of wind patterns and landmarks, all working together in a symphony of navigation that allows a bird born in one location to find its way back to that exact same place year after year with remarkable fidelity. When we observe this phenomenon, we witness something that operates on a scale of awareness and purpose that fundamentally differs from our own understanding of home and belonging. For these birds are not consciously deciding where home is or calculating the optimal route through mathematics and maps as humans might do, but rather responding to an ancient calling that lives within their cells, a biological imperative that has been tested and refined across countless generations until it became nearly flawless. The remarkable thing about this migration is that it persists not because birds are driven by emotion or nostalgia as we might be, but because the system works with such perfect efficiency that there is no evolutionary pressure to change it. And yet we have somehow made this purely biological phenomenon into something that resonates with us on a deeply human level, transforming it into a metaphor for returning to our roots, for finding our way back to safety and belonging. For the universal desire to go home. We see in bird migration a kind of certainty and purpose that we often lack in our own lives, a demonstration that returning home is not a failure or a retreat, but rather a natural rhythm, a necessary cycle that allows creatures to thrive by following the seasons rather than fighting against them. And this realization can be profoundly soothing because it suggests that seeking comfort, seeking the familiar, seeking to return to places and people that matter to us is not weakness, but rather the most natural instinct in existence. In this light, the Arctic Tern's journey from pole to pole, covering nearly 44,000 miles annually, becomes not merely a feat of biological engineering, but a testament to the power of belonging, a living reminder that home is worth any distance, any effort, any sacrifice to return to it. And perhaps this is why we find such comfort in watching the seasonal return of familiar birds to our gardens and neighborhoods each spring. In their arrival, we recognize a kindred yearning, a validation that the pull toward home is not sentimental weakness, but rather one of life's most fundamental truths, written into the very fabric of existence itself. When we witness a robin returning to build its nest in the same tree, or hear the honking of geese overhead in perfect V formation, we are watching millions of years of wisdom made visible, a reminder that we, too, are creatures bound by invisible threads to the places that have shaped us, and that answering the call to return home is perhaps the most honest thing we can do. In this way, bird migration teaches us that home is not a fixed destination, but rather a dynamic relationship, a place we return to not because we are trapped by it, but because it continues to call us back, generation after generation, with a loyalty that transcends the passage of time and the vast distances that separate us from it. And in understanding this, we might begin to see our own seasonal returns, to childhood homes, to cherished landscapes, to the people who knew us before we became who we are, not as escapes from our present lives, but as essential recalibrations, moments when we realign ourselves with the deepest parts of our identity, just as a bird recalibrates itself by the stars. Consider the remarkable reality that bees move through the world pollinating flowers and plants without ever receiving compensation, without ever negotiating terms, without ever pausing to consider whether their labor might be undervalued or exploited. A bee emerges from its hive driven by instinct and chemical signals, traveling from flower to flower collecting nectar and pollen, and in this process it transfers genetic material between plants with a consistency and reliability that human agricultural systems have come to depend upon absolutely. The bee does not think about the economic value it creates, does not calculate the worth of the crops it enables, does not wonder whether the farmer benefits more than the bee itself benefits. It simply moves through the landscape performing this essential service as naturally as breathing, as automatically as the turning of the earth. This phenomenon persists because the bee operates within a different framework entirely from human economic consciousness. The bee has no concept of being owed something, no internal accounting system that tracks value given versus value received, no sense of injustice when its labor contributes to human prosperity. Instead, the bee follows patterns established over millions of years of evolution, patterns that make pollination not a transaction, but an inevitable consequence of the bee seeking its own nourishment. When the bee drinks from a flower, it must brush against the flower's reproductive structures, and when it travels to the next flower, this pollen transfers almost as a side effect of this primary pursuit. What makes this genuinely remarkable to contemplate is that humans have built entire agricultural economies on top of this freely given service, yet we have normalized its existence so completely that we rarely pause to acknowledge the strangeness of it. We have not had to develop systems of payment or incentive or coercion because the bee's behavior emerges from its fundamental nature rather than from choice. The pollination continues whether we acknowledge its value or not, whether we feel grateful or not, whether we build monuments to the bee's contribution or ignore it entirely. This represents a kind of pure, unconditional generosity embedded into the fabric of nature itself, a service that flows continuously without expectation precisely because it flows from instinct rather than from conscious decision. Yet in recent decades, as wild bee populations have collapsed and human agriculture has become increasingly dependent on managed honeybee colonies, we have finally begun to monetize what was once free, paying beekeepers to transport hives across continents, creating an economy around the very service that nature once provided without asking. This transformation reveals something profound. We can only recognize the value of what we have taken for granted once it threatens to disappear. And perhaps this is the most humbling lesson of all, that the systems we depend upon most critically are often those we have learned to ignore, and that gratitude, true recognition of what we receive without earning it, may only become possible when we face the genuine prospect of loss. The honeybee crisis has thus become a kind of involuntary teacher, forcing us to confront what we should have valued all along, not through economic calculation, but through the simple recognition that some of nature's most essential gifts arrive without invoice, without negotiation, asking only that we preserve the conditions for their continuation. The collapse of wild pollinators has taught us that freedom, the bee's freedom to pollinate without human interference or control, may itself be the condition necessary for the service to persist, and that our attempts to manage and monetize pollination risk destroying the very ecological relationships that make it possible in the first place. This paradox sits at the heart of our relationship with nature itself. The more we try to own and control the systems that sustain us, the more fragile they become, until we are forced to choose between releasing our grip and watching the entire structure collapse. Consider the simple yet profound cycle that occurs when rain falls upon the ground, a process so fundamental to existence that we often overlook its deeper significance and the way it shapes every living thing on this planet. When water descends from the sky in the form of rain, it does not simply wet the surface and disappear, but rather it penetrates into the soil, moving downward through layers of earth, carrying with it essential nutrients and minerals that have been waiting in the atmosphere, ready to be delivered to the roots of plants, trees, and all vegetation that depends upon this life-giving moisture to survive and flourish. The rain seeps deeper into the earth, replenishing groundwater reserves that have been depleted by drought or by the constant transpiration of plants during warm, sunny days, and this underground water becomes accessible to the extensive root systems that spread beneath the surface, drinking in this precious resource that sustains their growth and enables them to push upward toward the light. The mechanism behind this nourishment is both elegant and essential, for as water moves through the soil, it dissolves minerals and nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, transforming them into forms that plant roots can actually absorb and utilize for building new cells, strengthening stems, and producing the energy needed for photosynthesis and reproduction. Without this regular infusion of water from the rain, the earth would gradually become depleted, its fertility declining over time, its ability to support life diminishing with each passing season until nothing could grow in the hardened, parched ground. Yet we have come to accept this miracle so completely that we rarely pause to consider how utterly dependent all terrestrial life truly is upon this cycle. How a period without rain can bring drought and hardship, while regular rainfall brings abundance and renewal that seems almost automatic in its reliability. The truth persists in every ecosystem on Earth, from the smallest garden to the vast forests and grasslands, and we have normalized this necessity to such a degree that we often notice rain only when it is absent, only when drought threatens our crops and our water supplies, only when the earth begins to crack and our plants begin to wither. But rain, in its steady, quiet way, continues to do what it has done for millions of years, nourishing the earth with patient consistency, asking nothing in return except the basic physics of the water cycle to continue its eternal circulation through atmosphere and ground, through root and leaf, through all the living things that depend upon this fundamental truth of our world. From the tiniest moss clinging to a forest floor to the mightiest redwood reaching toward the heavens, every living thing bears witness to this truth, and in recognizing the nourishment that rain provides, we begin to understand not merely how life survives, but how it thrives, transforms, and renews itself in an endless dance of growth and regeneration. In this way, rain becomes not merely weather or meteorological necessity, but a teacher of profound interconnection, showing us that nourishment flows not in isolation but through webs of relationship, where what falls from above sustains what grows below, and where the health of soil, plant, and creature remain inseparably bound together in the ancient partnership that has allowed life to flourish across continents and through countless generations. When we witness a single raindrop striking parched soil and feel the earth respond with the emergence of green shoots within days, we are observing this ancient partnership made visible, a tangible reminder that nourishment is never one-directional, but rather a continuous exchange where the earth receives what it needs to give life back to us in abundance. In this reciprocal relationship, we find ourselves not as observers but as participants, for we too are nourished by the rain that falls, sustained by the same cycle that feeds the soil and green world around us, reminding us that our survival is woven into the very fabric of this ancient. Consider the moment when winter snow blankets the landscape, transforming everything into a pristine, crystalline world of white silence and frozen beauty, where the snow seems eternal and permanent, covering the earth in a thick layer that appears as though it might remain indefinitely, as though this cold season might stretch on forever without reprieve or change. And yet, despite this appearance of permanence, and despite the way snow seems to settle in for the long term, there exists a fundamental truth that operates silently beneath the surface of winter itself. The snow will melt eventually, and this melting is not a matter of chance or uncertainty, but rather an inevitable consequence of the physical laws governing temperature, season, and the rotation of our planet around the sun. The mechanism behind this universal truth is elegantly simple, rooted in thermodynamics and the basic properties of matter. For snow exists as a frozen state of water, held in crystalline form only because the temperature remains below a critical threshold. And as soon as conditions shift, as soon as warmth from the sun returns with increasing intensity, or as the ambient air temperature climbs above freezing, the molecular structure of snow begins to vibrate and loosen. The bonds that held it in solid form weaken, and the transformation back into liquid water becomes inevitable and unstoppable, a process that requires no external intervention or human effort, but simply the patient passage of time and the turning of seasons. Yet despite understanding this mechanism completely, despite knowing with absolute certainty that every winter snow will eventually melt, people often feel a sense of burden during the depths of winter, a psychological weight that settles alongside the physical snow, as though the cold might somehow be different this year, as though summer might not arrive, as though the eternal winter of one's current circumstances might actually persist forever. And this contradiction between intellectual knowledge and emotional experience reveals something profound about how our minds process time and change when we are embedded within a difficult season. For the very thing we know with certainty to be temporary can feel profoundly permanent when we are living through it. This is why the wisdom of snow melts eventually extends far beyond meteorology. It becomes a meditation on faith itself, a reminder that the gap between what we know intellectually and what we feel emotionally can be bridged not through greater understanding, but through trust in the patient, inexorable turning of seasons, both literal and metaphorical. When we learn to hold this understanding, that winter always yields to spring, that hardship contains within it the seeds of its own ending, We develop a resilience not born from denying difficulty, but from recognizing its transience. And in this recognition lies a quiet strength that can sustain us through the darkest, coldest seasons of our lives. This is not to say that the melting happens all at once, or that we will feel transformed the moment conditions begin to shift. Rather, like snow itself, which melts in incremental thaws, sometimes freezing again before the final warmth arrives, our own transformations often proceed in fits and starts, with setbacks and plateaus that test our faith in the process. Yet each small thaw, each minor warming, each barely perceptible movement towards spring is real and significant, a physical manifestation of change already underway beneath surfaces that may still appear frozen to our weary eyes. And so when we notice the first rivulet of water trickling down a hillside, or when we see the dark earth beginning to show through a thinning snowpack, or when we feel the sun's warmth linger just a moment longer on our skin each afternoon, we are witnessing not the beginning of spring, but rather evidence that spring has already begun its quiet work beneath the surface, and in learning to recognize these small signs of transformation, we train ourselves to trust in processes larger than our current perception, to believe in endings we cannot yet fully see. When you look up at the sky on a day when gray clouds dominate the entire visible expanse above you, when the light has dimmed and the world below feels smaller and more confined, it is easy to believe that this particular arrangement of weather will persist indefinitely, that the clouds have somehow decided to settle permanently into their current position, and that the sun might never emerge again from behind their thick, rolling masses. And yet, without exception, every single cloud that has ever formed in the atmosphere has eventually moved away, dissolved, transformed into something else entirely, or simply ceased to exist in the form you once observed it in. This is not a matter of opinion or wishful thinking, but rather a fundamental characteristic of how our atmosphere actually functions. Clouds are not permanent fixtures attached to the sky like paint on a canvas, but rather they are dynamic collections of water vapor and ice crystals that are constantly in motion, constantly being pushed by winds at various altitudes, constantly evaporating and reforming and traveling across vast distances at speeds we rarely perceive in real time. When you stand beneath a cloud and watch it for a few minutes, you might notice almost nothing changing, but if you were to observe that same cloud over the course of several hours from a stationary vantage point, you would witness a transformation so complete that you might not recognize it as the same cloud at all. The psychological mechanism at work when we assume a cloud will stay forever has to do with the way our perception of time compresses when we are immersed in an immediate experience. The cloud feels permanent because it is present right now, because it is affecting our current mood and current weather conditions, because its presence feels like a statement about reality rather than a temporary condition. We have learned to trust what we can see in front of us more than we trust the patterns we have observed repeatedly throughout our entire lives. The countless times we have seen storms pass, seen overcast mornings transform into clear afternoons, seen the sun return again and again after being hidden. And yet we continue to feel surprised when the clouds move, continue to feel a sense of relief when they finally depart, as though each instance were unprecedented rather than simply the continuation of a pattern so consistent and so reliable that weather forecasting itself is built upon the certainty of it. The next time you find yourself under a gray sky, you might pause to remember that you have survived every previous darkness, that the atmosphere has never failed to deliver on this promise, and that the very clouds obscuring your view are already in the process of their inevitable departure, whether you can perceive it or not. The wind that moves them is already at work, and the water that comprises them is already beginning its transformation back into invisible vapor, returning to the cycle that has sustained life on this planet for billions of years. A cycle so ancient and so reliable that it asks nothing of you except to wait and to notice. And in this waiting, in this noticing, you might discover that the clouds passing overhead are teaching you something about all the other storms in your life, the anxieties that seem permanent, the difficulties that feel insurmountable, the dark periods you fear might never lift, each one subject to the same immutable laws of change that govern the sky, each one already in motion toward its own inevitable dispersal, whether you can see it yet or not. Perhaps this is why so many cultures have used the sky as a mirror for the human condition, not because clouds and storms are truly like our problems, but because they offer us the most reliable proof we have that nothing, however overwhelming it appears in the present moment, remains in its current form forever. And in learning this lesson from the sky, we equip ourselves with a tool more valuable than any forced optimism. The simple, observable truth that change is not something that might happen, but something that is already happening in every moment, whether when you cut your finger on paper or scrape your knee on concrete or sustain any manner of injury to your skin, your body immediately begins an extraordinary process that requires almost no conscious effort on your part. A biological symphony that unfolds with such precision and efficiency that you rarely need to intervene beyond basic cleaning and perhaps a simple bandage. Your body possesses an innate intelligence that has been refined across millions of years of evolution, a sophisticated system of cells and proteins and chemical signals that recognize damage and spring into action without you having to think about it or worry about whether the process will work. The moment your skin is broken, specialized white blood cells rush to the site of injury, bacteria and debris are cleared away, and a cascade of biological events begins that will eventually seal the wound closed, restoring the barrier between your internal systems and the external world. The process is so automatic, so deeply encoded into your physiology, that you can simply go about your day while your body handles the repair work entirely on its own, continuing to function normally even as millions of cellular processes are occurring beneath your awareness to heal the damage. This remarkable capacity exists because your body has evolved survival mechanisms that prioritize restoration and healing above nearly everything else. Because organisms that could not close their wounds would not have survived to pass on their genes, and because over countless generations, the bodies that were most efficient at self-repair were the ones that thrived and reproduced and eventually led to you. Your skin cells naturally divide and proliferate in the wound area, collagen is deposited to create structure and strength, and blood vessels are rebuilt to restore circulation to the damaged tissue, all according to a biological script that was written long before you were born, all following a pattern that has worked successfully countless times in your own life and in the lives of every human who came before you. The mechanism is both chemical and cellular, involving growth factors and immune responses and the coordinated behavior of dozens of different cell types, all working toward the single goal of closing the wound and restoring the integrity of your skin. Your body does not hesitate or question whether this process will succeed. It simply executes the program because that is what bodies do, because that is what they have always done, because healing is the default state of living systems when given even the most basic conditions to work with. Yet despite the fact that this process has worked reliably throughout your entire life, despite the countless cuts and scrapes and injuries you have sustained and recovered from without any intervention beyond washing your hands and perhaps applying a bandage, most people still experience a moment of worry or concern when they notice a fresh wound, as though this time might be different, as though the healing process might somehow fail or take an impossibly long time or result in permanent damage. This anxiety persists even though you have direct, personal evidence stretching back across your entire existence that your body knows exactly how to handle this situation. Even though you have never experienced a simple wound that failed to close, even though the biological machinery is so reliable that billions of people manage millions of injuries every single day without complications. The worry is perhaps a vestigial remnant of times when infections were more likely and medical care was not available, when a wound truly could become life-threatening, when vigilance and concern were genuinely adaptive responses that increased your chances of survival. But that context has changed, and yet the worry remains, a ghost of evolutionary concern that persists even though modern sanitation and modern medicine have made simple wound closure almost a certainty for the vast majority of injuries that occur in everyday life. Every scar on the human body carries within it a narrative of survival, a mark that represents a moment when the body was challenged and chose to persist rather than fail. And when you look at these marks with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, you begin to understand that they are not blemishes or imperfections, but rather evidence of resilience etched into the very tissue that keeps us alive. A scar forms through a remarkable biological process where damaged skin cells are replaced not with identical tissue, but with a different composition of collagen fibers that create a protective seal over the wound. And this process mirrors something deeper about how we move through difficult moments in our lives, transforming trauma into something that holds us together rather than tears us apart. When you think about the stories behind these marks, You recognize that a scar from a childhood fall speaks to a moment of learning how fragile and yet unbreakable the body can be, while a surgical scar represents a deliberate intervention made in service of survival or healing, and every scar is fundamentally a record of the body choosing to repair itself rather than remain broken. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with scars is rooted in our intuitive understanding that these marks represent the intersection of vulnerability and strength, the point where something was broken and yet mended, and this combination carries an emotional weight that smooth, unblemished skin simply cannot convey because it lacks the narrative dimension that comes from visible transformation. What makes this truth particularly compelling to reflect upon as you drift towards sleep is that we have largely normalized the idea that scars are things to hide or minimize, when in reality, they represent one of the most honest truths about existence itself, which is that everyone carries marks from their struggles, whether those marks are visible on the skin or invisible within the deeper architecture of personality and character. Our culture has taught us to fear these visible reminders of our vulnerability, to cover them with makeup or clothing, to speak about them in apologetic tones as though they represent failure rather than survival. And yet, despite all these social pressures to erase or minimize them, scars persist as stubborn reminders that we are not meant to move through life unscathed, and that the movement through pain toward healing is not something shameful, but rather something that deserves to be witnessed and honored. As you close your eyes and let your consciousness settle into the quietness of sleep, consider that every person you have ever known or will ever know carries scars of some kind, and in that shared reality, there is a profound comfort because it means that no one is meant to be perfect, and the marks of survival are actually the most beautiful proof that we belong to the human experience in all its honest and unvarnished complexity. So when you notice a scar on your own body or on someone you encounter tomorrow, pause long enough to honor what that mark represents, not as something to apologize for, but as a visible testament to the body's extraordinary capacity to transform injury into integration, to take what was broken and weave it into the ongoing narrative of survival that makes you undeniably, irreplaceably human. And in this way, a scar becomes not a mark of damage, but a bookmark in your personal history, a physical chapter marker that says, "Here is where I was tested, and here is where I learned that I could endure," reminding you each time you glimpse it that your body has always known how to survive what your mind feared it could not. In this way, scars become a language of the body, one that speaks fluently of courage without needing to announce itself. And when you learn to read this language, in the thin line across a palm, the silvered stretch mark that maps growth, the small indentation that marks where a surgeon's precision saved a life, you begin to see that the most compelling stories are not those of perfection, but those written in the grammar of survival itself. When you experience pain, whether it arrives suddenly through injury or builds slowly through illness or emotional loss, there exists within the human body and mind a remarkable biological process that begins immediately to reduce its intensity. And this process unfolds not all at once in a dramatic transformation, but rather in nearly imperceptible increments that accumulate over hours and days and weeks, until one morning you realize that what once felt unbearable has become merely uncomfortable, and what once consumed your every waking thought now occupies only the periphery of your attention. This gradual diminishment of pain operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the physical mechanisms where your nervous system naturally downregulates pain signals over time, where inflammation subsides, where damaged tissue slowly repairs itself, and where your brain's own chemical systems release endorphins and other compounds that naturally ease discomfort even without conscious intervention. Beyond the purely physical realm, your mind engages in its own process of adaptation and normalization, where the shock of acute pain gradually transforms into a chronic baseline that your consciousness learns to accommodate and integrate, much like how a constant background noise eventually becomes invisible to your awareness simply through exposure and familiarity, and the brain's remarkable ability to filter out persistent stimuli in favor of novel ones. The psychological mechanism underlying this gradual lessening involves a combination of acceptance and habituation, where resisting pain and fighting against it actually amplifies the suffering, while gradually surrendering to its presence and allowing it to exist without judgment somehow makes it more bearable, more manageable, less all-consuming in its scope. What makes this truth so remarkable is that pain does not require your permission or your understanding to lessen. It does not depend on your conscious effort or your deliberate actions to heal, and yet we often spend our energy fighting against the pain itself, rather than trusting in this natural process of gradual diminishment that your body and mind have evolved to perform without your interference. The normalization of suffering in human experience has created a paradox where we simultaneously believe that pain is permanent while also understanding intellectually that nothing in life maintains its intensity forever. And yet we still find ourselves surprised when the acute agony we felt months ago has faded to a dull ache, or when an emotional wound that once felt like it would destroy us has transformed into something we can carry without it defining our entire existence. And this disconnect between our intellectual knowledge and our emotional expectations reveals something profound about the resilience that exists within you regardless of your circumstances. The wisdom lies not in waiting passively for time to heal, but in recognizing that each small moment of relief, each hour when you forget to think about your suffering, each day when the weight feels slightly lighter than the day before, represents the quiet victory of a process that has been working on your behalf all along, asking only that you continue to breathe and move forward even when forward feels impossibly slow. And perhaps the greatest gift of this gradual lessening is that it teaches you something essential about the nature of all human experience, that nothing remains static, that even the most overwhelming circumstances contain within them the seeds of their own transformation, and that by simply continuing to show up for your life day after day, you become a participant in your own healing rather than a passive victim of your pain. This understanding transforms how you move through subsequent pain, because you enter it no longer as a stranger to suffering, but as someone who has witnessed its gradual dissolution before, and this accumulated knowledge becomes a quiet confidence that carries you through the darkest moments, not because the pain will disappear tomorrow, but because you have learned through your own bod. As you lie in the darkness of your bedroom, consider the remarkable truth that everything you remember will gradually, almost imperceptibly, slip away from the clarity it once possessed. The vivid details of events that once consumed your entire mind, the exact words someone spoke, the precise color of the sky on a particular afternoon, the specific sensation of a moment that felt absolutely unforgettable. These elements soften over time like watercolors left in the rain, becoming less distinct and more impressionistic with each passing season. You might recall that something important happened, that you felt something deeply, that a person mattered greatly to you, yet the sharp edges of these memories round themselves into something gentler, something less demanding of your emotional energy. This is not a failure of your mind or a tragedy of human consciousness, but rather an elegant mechanism of psychological survival, a built-in mercy that your brain extends to itself without your conscious permission or awareness. The neurological basis for this fading is rooted in the actual physical nature of how memories are stored, not as perfect recordings like a video camera might capture, but as patterns of neural connections that require constant reinforcement to maintain their intensity. Each time you do not think about a memory, the neural pathways associated with it become slightly less active, slightly less reinforced, and the memory itself becomes proportionally less vivid, less emotionally charged, less immediately accessible. Over months and years, what was once an overwhelming experience becomes a fact you know about yourself rather than something you truly feel, and this transformation is neither good nor bad. It simply is the way consciousness works to prevent us from being forever crushed beneath the weight of past pain. What is perhaps most remarkable about this gentle fading is how completely we accept it as inevitable while simultaneously being surprised by it each time it occurs. How we can look back on a photograph and feel startled that we cannot quite remember the exact emotions we experienced in that moment. Yet we never seem to truly anticipate that the present moment we are living in right now will eventually fade in exactly the same way. You worry about forgetting things that matter, you try to hold on to precious details, you might even write them down or take photographs, yet you know in your deepest self that the sharpness will eventually dull, the intensity will eventually soften, and the pain will eventually become manageable simply because your mind will have allowed it to become a little bit smaller, a little bit less present, a little bit less true. This fading is one of life's most underrated comforts, a quiet dissolution of suffering that happens automatically, that requires nothing from you but time, and that works tirelessly in your favor even as you sleep, even as you lie here in this darkness, allowing the day to recede from you just as all days eventually recede into the gentle, forgiving blur of the past. And so you can release your grip on today with a little more grace, knowing that the sharp edges of whatever troubles you now will eventually soften into something you can carry more easily, that the person you are at this moment will become a memory of yourself that grows kinder and less demanding with time, until one day you will barely recognize the urgency with which you once held onto things that now seem distant and small. Perhaps this is why the ancient philosophers spoke of time as a kind of mercy, not because it erases who we were, but because it allows us to become someone new, someone unburdened by the terrible clarity of every wound we once thought would define us forever. The heartbreak that felt eternal becomes a story you tell about yourself. The shame that once burned becomes a footnote. The joy that seemed irreplaceable transforms into a warmth you can no longer quite locate, but somehow still carry with you. In our modern world, silence has become something we actively avoid, yet when we find ourselves in moments of genuine quiet, we often discover that these intervals hold a depth and utility that our constant noise and stimulation cannot replicate. Consider the person who sits alone in their home after a long day of meetings, conversations, notifications, and demands on their attention, and notices how their shoulders drop slightly as the ambient sound fades, how their breath naturally deepens, and how thoughts that had been fragmented and scattered suddenly begin to organize themselves into something resembling clarity. This is not merely a pleasant sensation or a matter of preference. Silence actually facilitates profound cognitive processes that require space to unfold. When we remove the external input that constantly demands our processing power, our brain enters what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a state where memory consolidation occurs, where creative connections form between previously separate ideas, and where our sense of self and purpose can reorganize itself. Yet despite this scientific understanding, we continue to fill nearly every waking moment with sound, music, podcasts, conversations, and digital noise, treating silence as an uncomfortable void to escape rather than as a valuable resource. The irony is particularly striking because silence costs nothing, requires no subscription or purchase, and remains universally available to anyone who simply chooses to access it, yet we actively pay money and expend significant effort to avoid it through endless entertainment options and constant connectivity. This pattern suggests that we have somehow internalized a cultural belief that silence equals emptiness, that it represents wasted time or failure to be productive, when in fact the opposite is true. Silence is where our deepest processing happens, where stress dissolves, where the nervous system finds genuine rest, and where meaning emerges from the constant tumult of sensation. The value of silence lies not in what happens during it, but in what becomes possible because of it. When we finally allow ourselves to sit in silence, we often find that solutions to problems we've been wrestling with suddenly become visible, or that decisions we've been avoiding clarify themselves without any conscious effort on our part. A reminder that some of our most important work happens not when we are striving, but when we are still. Perhaps this is why many of the world's greatest thinkers, artists, and leaders have consistently returned to silence as a practice, not as a luxury or indulgence, but as an essential discipline that sharpens perception and deepens wisdom in ways that constant activity simply cannot achieve. In choosing silence, we choose to trust that our minds and spirits know how to heal and grow when given the space to do so. The monks who took vows of silence centuries ago understood something we are only beginning to relearn. That restraint from speech is not deprivation but liberation, freeing us from the exhausting performance of constant self-presentation and allowing us to simply be. In this sense, silence becomes an act of profound self-respect, a boundary we place around our inner world that permits it to exist and flourish without the demand for constant external validation or expression. When we reclaim silence, we reclaim sovereignty over our own inner life, a reclamation that becomes increasingly radical in a world designed to monetize our attention and keep us perpetually engaged with external stimuli. This simple act of choosing quiet is, in its way, an act of resistance against the constant pressure to produce, consume, and perform. The question then becomes not whether we can afford to embrace silence, but whether we can afford to continue without it. Whether a life lived in constant noise is truly a life fully lived, or merely a distraction from the deeper work of becoming who we are meant to be. When you find yourself caught in the momentum of daily life, rushing from one task to the next, your mind becomes like a snow globe that has just been shaken, with thoughts and concerns swirling in every direction, obscuring whatever truth might exist beneath the turbulence. Yet the moment you pause and allow yourself to sit quietly without agenda or distraction, something remarkable begins to happen as the mental agitation gradually settles and the fog that seemed so permanent begins to lift naturally, revealing patterns and insights that were always present but invisible beneath the noise. This is not a mysterious phenomenon, but rather a consequence of how human attention actually works. For when your mind is in constant motion, it operates in a reactive state where you are perpetually responding to stimuli, managing immediate demands, and processing surface-level information, leaving no cognitive resources available for the deeper integration and pattern recognition that constitutes genuine understanding. Stillness creates the conditions for your brain to shift from this reactive survival mode into a reflective state where it can make connections between disparate experiences, examine your assumptions without judgment, and access the accumulated wisdom of your own lived experience that exists just beyond the reach of your anxious, busy thinking. In this quiet space, questions that seemed impossibly complex often resolve themselves naturally, not because you have forced an answer, but because your mind has been given permission to process at its own deeper level, sorting through information and experiences in the background of consciousness, the way water naturally clarifies when you stop stirring it. Yet despite this being a fundamental truth about human cognition, and despite the accessibility of stillness, most people move through their entire lives in a state of perpetual agitation, treating quiet moments as somehow wasteful or self-indulgent rather than recognizing them as essential maintenance for mental functioning, continuing to believe that clarity comes from thinking harder or doing more when in reality the opposite is consistently true. That the answers you need are usually found in the spaces between your striving, where your mind can finally rest long enough to see what has been obvious all along. The next time you face a decision that feels urgent or a problem that seems unsolvable, resist the urge to intensify your mental effort. Instead, step away, sit in silence for even a few minutes, and notice how the clarity you were chasing through force arrives quietly on its own, like a photograph developing in solution, requiring only your patient stillness to become visible. This is why the ancient practice of meditation, the modern tool of a morning pause before checking your phone, and even the simple act of taking a walk in nature all share the same essential mechanism. They interrupt the noise long enough for your mind to remember that clarity was never something you needed to manufacture, only something you needed to stop obscuring with your constant reaching for it. When you stop treating stillness as a luxury and begin recognizing it as a prerequisite for intelligent living, you free yourself from the exhausting illusion that more effort always yields better results, and you discover instead that some of life's most important decisions, the ones that truly matter, become obvious only when you finally quiet down enough to hear your own deepest knowing. So the paradox resolves itself. By doing less, by demanding nothing of yourself in those quiet moments, you accomplish more than all your frantic striving could ever achieve, because clarity is not something that arrives through force but through permission. Permission to be still enough that your own wisdom can finally break through the surface and speak to you in a voice you have always known but rarely take time to hear. And perhaps this is why your most creative breakthroughs, your wisest choices, and your deepest sense of purpose have almost always arrived not during your hours of striving, but in the shower, on a walk, or in that. Consider the moment when you realize you have been holding your breath without noticing, or when anxiety has caused your breathing to become shallow and rapid, and then you deliberately pause and take one long, deep breath and feel something shift within you almost immediately, as though a small reset button has been pressed somewhere in the depths of your nervous system. This experience is not metaphorical or imagined, but rather a physiological reality that your body understands at a level far deeper than your conscious mind typically operates. When you breathe deeply and intentionally, you are directly communicating with the autonomic nervous system, that ancient part of yourself that governs heart rate and stress responses, and the fundamental sense of safety or danger that permeates your consciousness at all times. The breath serves as a bridge between the voluntary and involuntary systems, one of the few mechanisms you possess that operates both automatically without your attention and under your conscious control when you choose to direct your awareness toward it. Each exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of you designed for rest and recovery and digestion, signaling to your entire being that the immediate threat has passed, that you are safe enough to relax and rebuild. This is why a single conscious breath can genuinely alter your state, why people across thousands of years and countless cultures have discovered that breath work is a fundamental tool for recalibrating the mind and body. Yet we live in societies that rarely teach this simple practice or encourage its use, despite the overwhelming evidence of its effectiveness. We have built lives that encourage holding our breath, that create constant low-level tension and vigilance, and then we struggle with anxiety and insomnia, and a persistent sense of being unsettled, all while the solution remains as close as the air moving in and out of your lungs, waiting silently for you to remember that a reset has always been available, that you have never truly been without this power to change your internal state in an instant. The next time you notice tension creeping into your shoulders, or fear tightening your chest, or mind spiraling through possibilities that have not yet occurred, pause and ask yourself, what would happen if I simply breathed? You may be surprised to discover that the answer has been within you all along, patient and constant and free. And you will find that this practice compounds over time. The more you pause to breathe consciously, the more your nervous system learns to recognize that you are the one in control, that safety is not something that must be earned through vigilance, but can be restored through this simple, sovereign act of turning your attention inward and allowing your body to remember what it has always known. Until one day you realize that breathing is not just a tool for managing difficult moments, but a language your body speaks constantly, offering you feedback about your life. Shallow breath whispers that you are braced against something, while deep rhythmic breath announces that you have truly arrived, that you are present and whole and held by the simple fact of being alive. And so the practice becomes not a technique to escape discomfort, but an invitation to return home to yourself again and again, each breath a small homecoming that reminds you that you have never left, that peace has always been here, waiting in the space between your exhale and your next inhale. In this way, breathing becomes not something you do to yourself, but something you do with yourself, a conversation between the part of you that is anxious and the part of you that is wise, each breath a word spoken in a language older than thought, reminding you that you are far more resourced than any moment of panic could ever suggest. And when you finally understand this, when you move from knowing it intellectually to feeling it in your body, you realize that every single breath is an opportunity to choose presence over panic, to reset not just your nervous system, but your entire relationship with the moment. Consider the moment when you plant a seed in soil, water it, and then walk away, returning weeks later to discover that something alive has pushed through the earth toward light it has never seen before, driven by an intelligence that exists without thought, without planning, without any conscious intention whatsoever, yet it finds the way forward with a persistence that defies explanation. This is not metaphor but observable reality, and it happens everywhere around us if we pause long enough to notice it. Plant does not debate whether it should grow toward the sun. It simply does because something in its nature compels it forward, and this same principle operates throughout all of life in ways both obvious and subtle. When an animal loses a limb, its body does not surrender to the loss but instead begins the invisible work of healing, calling forth cells to multiply and reorganize in patterns that reconstruct what was taken, asking nothing in return but time and the basic nutrients of survival. When a river encounters a stone, it does not stop or question the obstacle, but finds the path around it, beneath it, or through it over centuries, demonstrating a form of patient determination that requires no emotion, no motivation beyond the simple fact of its own existence and movement. What we are witnessing in all these instances is the profound truth that life possesses an inherent tendency to persist, to find solutions, to continue existing even in the face of conditions that logic suggests should prevent it entirely. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to operate at the level of biological necessity and what might be understood as the fundamental nature of matter itself, where organisms develop adaptations through countless generations, each small variation either helping or hindering survival, and those that help tend to persist while others fade away. This process, which we call evolution, is not driven by any conscious goal or predetermined design, but rather by the simple mathematics of reproduction and selection, where those organisms that find ways to survive tend to have more offspring, who inherit those successful strategies, gradually building complexity and capability across time. But beyond even this explanation lies something more mysterious, something that suggests life itself has a directional quality, that wherever conditions permit, biological systems will emerge and organize themselves toward greater complexity, greater resilience, and greater capacity to persist. We do not fully understand why this should be true, why the universe should produce beings that resist entropy and disorder, why living systems should consistently find novel solutions to problems they have never encountered before, often in ways that seem to require a form of creativity or foresight that no individual organism actually possesses. Yet observe it we must, because it remains true whether we understand it or not, and this truth offers a profound comfort to those who contemplate it carefully. There is something deeply settling about recognizing that you live in a universe where finding ways is not just possible, but appears to be the fundamental operating principle of existence itself, where life has consistently discovered pathways forward through conditions of extreme adversity and apparent impossibility. The desert blooms after rain, the seed germinates in the crevice of concrete, the body heals from wounds that should prove fatal, the species adapts to new environments within generations. Humans solve problems they once believed unsolvable, not because any individual planned the solution from the beginning, but because life simply continues trying, exploring, adjusting, and gradually moving forward in directions that become solutions only in retrospect. We have normalized this miracle so thoroughly through our daily lives that we scarcely notice it anymore. Yet if you truly consider what it means for life to find ways, you realize you are surrounded by evidence of possibility at every moment. Evidence that suggests the universe leans toward persistence, toward survival, toward the continuation of E. Consider for a moment the vast web of causality that surrounds your existence, the invisible threads that bind every person, event, and circumstance into a tapestry so intricate that tracing any single strand backward or forward leads inevitably to every other strand in the weave. When you meet someone entirely by chance at a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, that meeting exists as the culmination of countless decisions, movements, and timing adjustments made by both of you over years or even decades. Decisions that seemed unrelated at the time, but converge at that precise moment in a way that feels almost impossible to have occurred by accident. The person who becomes your closest friend may have only entered your life because your usual route to work was blocked by construction, forcing you to walk a different street where you happen to notice a flyer for a class you would never have taken otherwise. And in that class, you sat next to someone who introduced you to the person who would change your entire life's trajectory. When you experience a problem in your work, the solution often comes from a conversation you had months earlier about something entirely unrelated. Words that stuck with you for no particular reason suddenly becoming the exact wisdom you needed to hear at precisely the right moment. The book you pick up randomly from a library shelf contains a passage that speaks directly to a dilemma you have been struggling with privately. A passage written by an author who experienced something remarkably similar decades before you were even born, and somehow their words across that expanse of time reach forward to meet your need. This interconnectedness operates through mechanisms both obvious and subtle. The laws of physics ensure that every action creates ripples through the world around it. Social networks and communication systems mean that information spreads in unexpected directions, and simple probability dictates that when you have enough variables interacting over enough time, meaningful coincidences become not just possible, but inevitable. The psychological dimension of this phenomenon involves our brain's natural inclination to recognize patterns and meaning, to see connections even where they might not exist, which actually serves us well because it trains us to notice the very real connections that do exist all around us constantly. Yet despite understanding these logical mechanisms, despite knowing that causality is real and that networks of influence are tangible, we still experience genuine awe and wonder when we witness meaningful connection. When we recognize that something we did or learned connects perfectly to something someone else needed. When we see proof that we are all participating in an enormous system that is somehow both random and perfectly coordinated. And this sense of wonder persists even as we grow older and gather more evidence that everything truly does connect, that separation is more illusion than reality, that our individual lives are part of something so much larger and more intricate than we could ever fully comprehend from within it. And perhaps this is why so many of us feel compelled to act with intention and kindness, sensing on some level that our choices ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or contain, that the small gesture of listening to a struggling friend or sharing an idea freely might be the exact thread that, when pulled, unravels into someone else's salvation or transformation years down the line. The barista who remembers your order, the stranger who holds the door, the teacher who believes in you when you don't believe in yourself. Each of these becomes a thread in someone else's story, a moment of connection that may seem insignificant in the instant, but reverberates forward through time in ways neither of you will ever fully know, reminding us that living consciously means recognizing that we are always, inevitably, mattering to the world around us. Consider the moments when you have felt genuinely afraid for someone you love, when worry has seized your chest and your mind has spiraled into catastrophic possibilities. Yet despite this fear, you have remained present with them, vulnerable with them, choosing connection over the protective distance that fear whispers would keep you safe. This is the paradox that defines human resilience in its most tender form. Fear, by its very nature, is supposed to protect us through withdrawal and self-preservation, through the construction of walls and the creation of distance between ourselves and potential sources of pain. Yet love, which seems entirely at odds with this defensive mechanism, consistently proves itself stronger, more durable, and more capable of sustaining us through the darkest chapters of our existence. When a parent sits beside a child during illness, when a partner holds the hand of someone facing loss, when a friend shows up despite their own terror about saying the wrong thing, love is not conquering fear in some dramatic external battle, but rather transcending it, moving through it, and ultimately outlasting it, because fear is designed for immediate threats, while love is designed for eternity. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals something profound about human motivation and meaning. Fear operates on a timeline of minutes and hours. It activates our nervous system in response to perceived danger and demands immediate action or withdrawal. Love, by contrast, operates on a timeline of years and decades and lifetimes. It settles into our cells and becomes the very foundation upon which we build our sense of purpose and belonging. When we love someone, we are essentially saying that their existence matters more to us than our own comfort, that the risk of pain is worth the possibility of connection, that we choose meaning over safety. This choice, made again and again across countless small moments, creates an accumulated weight that simply outlasts the temporary surges of fear. What makes this truth particularly striking is that we have somehow collectively decided that this hierarchy is not only acceptable but deeply natural, that love winning out over fear is not a surprising miracle, but the expected order of things. We have normalized the extraordinary act of people choosing vulnerability and continued presence despite their terror. We have decided that a mother will move heaven and earth for a child even when paralyzed by anxiety about their well-being, that a person will sit in a hospital room for months despite the daily panic of watching someone deteriorate, that humans will build lives and families and communities despite the constant knowledge that loss is inevitable. This normalization does not make the phenomenon any less remarkable, but rather speaks to how deeply wired into our being this capacity truly is. Love outlasts fear not because fear disappears or because we become braver in some conventional sense, but because we learn to carry both simultaneously, allowing love to be the organizing principle while fear becomes simply another, weather pattern passing through our emotional landscape. We learn to act despite fear, to choose despite fear, to open ourselves despite fear, and in doing so we discover that fear, while always present, gradually loses its power to dictate our choices or limit our connections. And perhaps this is the greatest gift we can offer one another, the knowledge that our love for them is not contingent on our fearlessness, but rather proven precisely in those moments when we are most afraid and choose connection anyway, making their existence feel worth every tremor of our hearts. In this way, love becomes not the absence of fear, but its constant companion and its gentle victor, a presence so steady and purposeful that it gradually rewrites our nervous system's understanding of what is worth protecting, teaching us that the deepest safety we can ever know comes not from the absence of risk, but from the certainty that we will not face our fears alone. Consider the moment when you arrive home after a long day away, perhaps hours of work or travel, during which your dog has been waiting alone in your house or apartment, with nothing but their thoughts and the passing of time to occupy them. Yet when you open that door, they greet you with an explosion of genuine joy that seems completely disproportionate to the ordinary nature of your return, tail wagging with such intensity that their entire back half seems to move in rhythm with pure excitement. Jumping and whining and pressing their body against your legs, as though you have just returned from some epic journey rather than a routine day. And this greeting is identical whether you left them for 8 hours or merely stepped out to check the mail, whether you had a wonderful day or a terrible one, whether you are happy to see them or preoccupied with your own concerns, because their emotional response exists independent of your emotional state or your worthiness on any given day. This phenomenon emerges from the fundamental way dogs experience attachment, a neurological and behavioral reality in which they bond to their caregivers through patterns of proximity, routine, and the meeting of their basic needs, creating an emotional investment that does not require judgment or evaluation of who you are as a person, what mistakes you may have made, or whether you deserve their affection based on some moral calculus. Unlike human love, which often comes conditional on reciprocation and appreciation and alignment of values and proof of commitment over time, canine love operates on a simpler plane of existence, where the presence of someone they recognize as their person and the continuation of the safe patterns they depend upon creates a sustained state of attachment that persists regardless of how you treat them, what mood you are in, or how you have failed them or disappointed them in the past. What remains remarkable is how we have come to normalize and even expect this kind of love from our dogs, how we take for granted that a creature could experience such consistent affection toward us despite having every logical reason to feel abandoned or resentful when we leave them alone for hours, despite having no contractual obligation to us, no social expectations binding them to loyalty, no future investment that requires maintaining our relationship, and yet they love us anyway. With a steadiness and reliability that human beings struggle to achieve even with conscious effort and deliberate choice, which suggests that perhaps the conditions under which unconditional love becomes possible are not as mysterious as we imagine, that the absence of judgment, the lack of scorekeeping, and the willingness to accept another being exactly as they are in each moment might be not a matter of moral superiority, but simply a different way of existing in relationship. One that dogs demonstrate every single day without fanfare or expectation of recognition. And perhaps that is why we keep returning to dogs, why we seek them out in our loneliness and our grief, why we photograph them and tell stories about them and build our lives around their schedules and needs. Because in their presence, we are reminded that love does not require us to be perfect, that we are worthy of attachment simply by existing, and that the unconditional acceptance they offer us is not a luxury reserved for the exceptional, but a fundamental way of being available to those we hold close. Perhaps this is the greatest gift dogs give us, not merely their loyalty, but permission to stop earning love, to rest in the knowledge that tomorrow, when we open that door again, we will be greeted with the same undiminished joy, the same full-bodied enthusiasm, regardless of what we have done or failed to do in the hours between. And in learning to accept that gift, to stop questioning whether we deserve it and simply receive it, we begin to understand what it might mean to love ourselves and others with that same radical absence of conditions, that same willingness to show up fully regardless of past failures or future uncertainties. Consider for a moment the profound journey that nitrogen takes in our atmosphere, suspended invisibly in the air we breathe, present in the vast quantities that surround our planet, yet locked away in a form that most living things cannot access or utilize for their own growth and survival. This nitrogen, which makes up roughly 78% of the air itself, exists in a state of chemical inertia, stable and unreactive in its molecular form, remaining largely isolated from the biological world below despite its overwhelming abundance. Yet beneath the storm clouds that gather and darken the sky, a remarkable transformation occurs with each flash of brilliant light that tears through the atmosphere, a transformation so fundamental and ancient that it has literally shaped the composition of soil itself since the earliest days of life on Earth. When lightning strikes with its tremendous electrical charge, it carries with it millions of volts and generates temperatures far exceeding those found on the surface of the sun, creating conditions so extreme and intense that they force the nitrogen molecules in the air to break apart and recombine with oxygen, forming nitrogen oxides that are entirely different in character and reactivity. These newly formed nitrogen compounds fall back to Earth with the rain that follows the storm, trickling down through the soil layers below, where they become available to plants and microorganisms that depend upon this nutrient for their fundamental survival and growth. The process seems almost miraculous in its elegance, yet it functions through pure chemistry and physics, through the simple physics of electrical discharge meeting the complex chemistry of atmospheric composition, creating through violence and energy a gift of life-giving nutrients that plants cannot manufacture on their own. We rarely consider that our most fertile soils, the grounds that have supported civilizations and crops throughout human history, owe their richness and their abundance to the regular occurrence of thunderstorms, to the ceaseless cycling of lightning that has been occurring for billions of years, transforming the unreactive into the reactive, the unavailable into the nourishing. This process persists as a foundational aspect of Earth's ecological systems, happening countless times each day across the planet, yet we pass through our lives largely unaware of this essential contribution, taking for granted the fertility beneath our feet, and rarely pausing to consider the violent atmospheric events that maintain this fertility generation after generation after generation. Yet even in our modern age of synthetic fertilizers and industrial agriculture, we cannot replicate this process with complete efficiency. A humbling reminder that nature's ancient mechanisms remain sovereigns of their own domain, quietly sustaining the living world through means both violent and generous, through storms that seem destructive yet are, in their essence, generative forces that have been writing the story of fertile earth since life itself began. In the depths of ancient forests and grasslands, the accumulated legacy of these lightning-born nutrients lies compressed in layers of dark, rich humus, a testament to the patient accumulation of nitrogen-fixing storms across millennia. Even now, a single thunderstorm can deposit as much fixed nitrogen as a farmer might apply artificially to an entire field, a silent reminder that the atmosphere itself remains our most generous and tireless fertilizer, working through lightning's violent hand to sustain the green world that depends upon its ceaseless labor. And so, when we witness a thunderstorm rolling across the horizon, we are not merely observing a meteorological event, but rather watching one of Earth's most ancient and essential soil-building processes unfold before our eyes. A process that continues to quietly fertilize the very ground beneath our feet with the same generosity it has bestowed upon the living world for over 3 billion years. Consider the person who has spent decades in comfortable routine, moving through days with a certain numbness, attending to obligations without particular awareness or gratitude, treating moments of connection as ordinary occurrences that will always be available tomorrow, speaking to loved ones with the assumption that there will be infinite future conversations to repair any distance or miscommunication that exists today, and then one day receiving news that fundamentally alters this perspective. Perhaps learning of their own diagnosis or the sudden loss of someone close, and suddenly everything shifts into focus with an almost unbearable clarity that transforms the mundane into the meaningful. In that moment, the cup of coffee in the morning becomes remarkable, the laugh of a child becomes precious, the ordinary conversation becomes sacred, and the hours spent in companionship become treasured in a way they never were before. This transformation reveals a psychological mechanism that operates within human consciousness. Our perception of value is fundamentally tied to scarcity and finitude, and when we truly internalize that our time and our relationships and our very existence are limited, bordered by an endpoint we cannot escape, everything we took for granted suddenly carries weight and significance that was always there but remained invisible to us. The mechanism is simple and elegant and cuts to something essential in how we process meaning and worth, for we cannot genuinely appreciate something we believe to be infinite or endlessly renewable. But the moment we understand that a resource is finite and that its time is running out, our relationship to it transforms completely. What persists despite this clear understanding is our tendency to forget, to slip back into the comfortable numbness, to live as though we have infinite tomorrows even though intellectually we know better, even though we have all encountered loss and difficulty that should have taught us this lesson permanently and thoroughly. We manage this through a kind of necessary psychological defense, a protective mechanism that allows us to function without being paralyzed by constant awareness of mortality. And yet the truth remains accessible to us whenever we consciously return to it, whenever we pause and remember that this breath is not guaranteed, that this moment with this person will never exist in exactly this configuration again, that the time we have is genuinely limited and therefore infinitely precious. This paradox sits at the center of human experience. We must forget enough to live, yet remembering restores meaning to everything we encounter. The person who sits with a dying parent and suddenly understands the preciousness of ordinary presence, the individual who survives an accident and finds themselves moved to tears by simple existence, the one who loses a friend and finally calls the people they love. These moments of awakening are not new insights, but rather remembrances of what was always true, invitations to live according to a reality we have always known but habitually ignored. The question then becomes not whether we understand this truth, but whether we have the courage to organize our lives around it, to let the knowledge of our finitude reshape our priorities, our choices, and the way we distribute our limited attention among the infinite demands competing for it, so that when we reach the end, we will have spent our precious hours on what genuinely mattered. And perhaps the deepest wisdom is recognizing that this reorganization need not wait for catastrophe, that we can choose, right now in this ordinary moment, to live as though we already understand what loss teaches, to treat this conversation, this meal, this day as the irreplaceable gift it actually is, transforming not through tragedy but through deliberate attention to the reality that has always surrounded us. For in the end, we discover that the preciousness was never bestowed by death. It was always inherent in the finite nature of existence itself, and death merely serves as the mirror that finally allows us to see it clearly. Consider the vastness of geological time, where mountains rise and erode over millions of years, where continents drift across the planet at the pace of fingernail growth, where stars burn for billions of years before collapsing into themselves. And you begin to understand that the universe operates on a timescale so incomprehensibly enormous that human impatience becomes almost laughable in its insignificance. When we feel rushed, when we believe that everything must happen immediately, when we convince ourselves that delays are catastrophes and waiting is suffering, we are measuring cosmic events against the rhythm of our heartbeats, comparing the age of mountains to the duration of a single human life. The universe has already waited longer than we can conceptualize, will continue waiting long after we are gone, and has never once demonstrated anxiety about whether things will happen on schedule. This is not patience in the way we understand it, not a virtue we choose to exercise, but rather the fundamental nature of how existence actually unfolds across the dimensions of space and time. When a seed lies dormant in soil for months before sprouting, it is not being patient because the seed has no consciousness to impatience. Yet something in this process feels deeply instructive to us, as though nature itself is teaching us something essential about the nature of timing and readiness. The universe does not rush because it has already calculated that everything worth doing requires duration, that transformation cannot happen in a moment, that the most profound changes emerge through accumulated time and persistent conditions rather than sudden force. We have normalized the idea that faster is always better, that delay is always frustration, that waiting is waste, yet observe how every living system on Earth moves according to rhythms that cannot be accelerated without breaking. A tree cannot be forced to grow taller by shouting at it, a wound cannot heal faster through pure will, a relationship cannot deepen through intensity alone, but only through the accumulated days of presence. This patient quality of the universe is not something separate from us, but rather the very substrate we are made of, woven into our bones and cells, and the way our minds require sleep and recovery and fallow periods to function properly. When we finally surrender to this patient rhythm, when we stop treating our lives as though they are behind schedule, something shifts in our nervous system and we begin to feel aligned with rather than opposed to the way things actually work. This alignment is not resignation or passivity, but rather the discovery that working with time instead of against it is how we actually accomplish what matters most, how the gardener's patient tending produces abundance, how the student's consistent study builds mastery, how the artist's repeated practice develops vision. We begin to understand that patience is not weakness, but the truest form of strength. The patient universe asks nothing of us except that we show up consistently, that we tend to what matters with attention rather than urgency, and that we trust the timing of our own unfolding the way we trust the seasons to return. In this trust lives a paradoxical freedom. When we release our grip on the timeline, we often move with greater effectiveness, our actions informed by clarity rather than desperation, our choices guided by what is actually needed rather than what panic demands. The universe has always known this, and now, finally, so can we. And perhaps this is why the most enduring human achievements, the cathedrals that took centuries to build, the scientific discoveries that required generations of accumulated knowledge, the love that deepens across decades, all bear the fingerprints of patience, all testify to the profound power that emerges when we align ourselves with time rather than resist it. When we finally internalize this lesson, we stop measuring our lives against impossible standards and instead become conscious participants in the universe's own patient unfolding, co-creators with time itself rather than its reluctant. Consider the simple fact that you have made it to this moment, to this very instant in time, despite all the obstacles that could have prevented your existence or your continuation within it. Every single day you wake up is a day you survived the previous night, a day you managed to navigate through countless micro-decisions and macro-circumstances that could have unfolded entirely differently. You are here because your parents met, because they chose to create life, because millions of biological processes aligned perfectly in ways that statisticians would call impossibly improbable. You are here because you avoided accidents that could have derailed your entire trajectory, because you happened to be looking the right direction at the right moment, because random chance and deliberate choices conspired together to keep you breathing. When you think about the sheer mathematical improbability of your own existence, the fact that you survived childhood, that you made it through adolescence with all its complications and dangers, that you navigated young adulthood and whatever came after, the simple truth emerges that persistence itself becomes a kind of miracle. Most people never truly contemplate this reality because it feels too abstract, too philosophical, too removed from the mundane experience of simply living day to day. We wake up, we go through our routines, we encounter challenges and obstacles and moments of joy, and we rarely pause to acknowledge that we are still here despite having no inherent guarantee of being here at all. The mechanism behind this normalization is simple enough. Survival becomes so routine that we forget it is actually extraordinary. We take for granted the basic fact of our continued existence because our brains are designed to focus on what comes next rather than celebrating what has already been achieved. Yet beneath this everyday normalcy lies a profound truth that deserves contemplation, especially during the quiet moments before sleep when your mind begins to settle and your defenses against wonder start to lower. You are here, present in this moment, conscious and aware, carrying with you the accumulated experience of every choice you made and every circumstance you survived. You have persisted through difficulties that felt insurmountable at the time, through periods of doubt and darkness and confusion, and you are still here. This continuation, this simple fact of your ongoing existence, requires no justification and no explanation other than the fact that you chose, consciously or unconsciously, to remain. The relaxation that comes from recognizing this truth lies in understanding that you have already proven yourself capable of survival, that you have already demonstrated resilience simply by being present in this moment, reading these words, breathing this air. There is a deep comfort in acknowledging that despite everything, despite all the reasons you might have disappeared from this world, you are remarkably, persistently, undeniably here. And perhaps that alone is enough, not as an ending point, but as a foundation upon which you can build whatever comes next, knowing that the hardest part, the mere act of continuing to exist through all that has come before, you have already mastered. So tomorrow, when you face whatever comes next, whether it is a routine day or a significant challenge, you can return to this simple anchor. You have survived 100% of your worst days so far, and that statistical reality is worth holding on to when uncertainty threatens to overwhelm you. You are still here not because life became easier or because uncertainty disappeared, but because something within you, whether you call it instinct, determination, or simply the momentum of existence itself, chose continuation over surrender, and that choice, made again and again across countless moments you may not even remember, is the quiet heroism that defines your life. Hold that truth close on the nights when you doubt your strength, and remember that every scar you carry is evidence of a battle you survived, not a mark of your weakness.